Hopefully, looking for heads shaking. Okay, good. Nodding. Hopefully, nodding, not shaking. Um, you know, is it is it everything you thought it would be as far as the work, the study required? Any surprises there? You can unmute. You can put it in the chat if you want to. What have you found to be helpful? You gonna leave me hanging? Oh, good. Thank you. Good to know. Practice test. That is very sharp, Jack, because probably from about this point forward, you really want to lean into those hardcore. Because again, it's like music. You know, you can read about how to play the piano, but until you actually play it, you're not going to make much progress. So the reading about it is the learning the content, but the playing it is the taking the test, applying the content to the actual test. That's what this sadly, I kind of wish it weren't this way. But it's like any standardized testing. It becomes more about the test than the material. And I guess it's just by necessity. But once you get through this, pass all this stuff and get out there in the wild, then you can just go do what you're probably naturally gifted at doing and working with people and applying your skills of problem solving to helping them accomplish their goals. Really, what you're going to be selling in this business is not real estate. It's like McDonald's is not in the fast food business, they're in the real estate business. We in the real estate business are in the please fall in love with me quickly business and stick with me for the next forever and always use me to help you with your real estate choices, right? You learn how to build that trust genuinely, build that rapport. So we got to get these pesky rules and laws out of the way. They're important because by learning them and executing them properly, we are protecting the public, which is ultimately the whole point, right? Got to help that client. I've had students before who didn't grasp this concept quickly. And when I got to the part about agency, which we're going to get into tonight, I'm going to carve things up a little differently because I feel like the agency discussion needs to happen before we dig much more deeply into the contracts. Because you need to know how we work with people and do the contracts and what our limitations and requirements are with our client, what our obligations are to our clients. So we're going to finish up 9 tonight and then hop over to 7. Well, I'm saying 7 in the yellow book. So we're going to finish up basic contract law, go over to basic agency because I kind of touched on that last time, but I really think it's important to lay the groundwork. They moved the syllabus around, they rearranged some topics, and I'm still kind of getting the feel for what I think is a good order. I think a lot of the new order is good, but I think it's probably going to be better to stick with the way it was before and talk about agency before we dig into contracts too much. So that's what's ahead. And in working with those clients properly, disclosing things properly, we're fulfilling our obligation and also building the trust that it requires to sell 12, 15 houses to somebody over the course of a 10, 15, 20-year career. I had a student one time who finally grasped this, and she said, wait a minute, as we'll learn tonight, I think we'll probably get to it tonight, there's occasionally a case where we owe so much to our client that we have to put them ahead of us all the time. We could end up getting less money or maybe even not getting paid if we didn't do things exactly right. When I told that to a class a couple of years ago, she said, well, I'm not doing this for free. I'm going to get mine. I'm like, understood. I don't want anybody to do it for free, but that is the risk we run. That's how highly the Real Estate Commission places fiduciary duties we owe to our client over our own best interest. Because again, what is the commission's main objective? This is testable, by the way. What does the commission exist to do? Who do they exist to protect?
The consumers.
You got it. The consumer, not us. What if we have a dispute between ourselves and another broker. And we think we deserve the commission, but another broker got the commission, and we have things signed and agency agreements, and we think that agent maybe stole our client from us or tried to solicit the client from us, even though we were under an agreement with them. Who do you think we might complain to about that? And it's not the real estate commission.
I think that's a civil case, right?
It's actually a trade association case. So it's the local board of realtors. But that's, I mean, if there might be a case where it overlaps, you can sue anybody for anything. But I think our first stop would be the Realtor Association, because that's what they exist for, to add ethics, code of ethics to this whole equation, more so than even what the commission has already implemented, and then to help with disputes between firms and between brokers. So let's do a little bit of review here. We got our live stream. Okay. Good to go. The big one that we pulled from last week were these V words. Tell me, what does it mean to have a valid contract? A valid contract between parties. Give me some ideas, some words that might apply to this idea. What's a valid contract? What are some characteristics of it?
That the buyer and seller have consequences for breaching it.
Perfect. That's really what I was going for. I was even hoping that you didn't even get into the four things that make it these four essential elements, because when we're comparing these V words, it's all about the consequences and who has consequences to stick to this contract when it's valid. Which parties? The buyer, the seller, both, or neither?
Both parties.
So when it's valid, they are both on the hook for keeping their promises. If they don't, they can be sued over it, right? And there are liquidated damages. There's opportunities for the buyer to get remedy from the seller. If the seller breaches, there's opportunity for the seller to get remedies from the buyer if the buyer breaches. So both have consequences. What about if it's a void contract? How many parties have consequences?
0.
Yeah,
Exactly. Neither one. Neither one have consequences. Either one could back out of the deal, and there's nothing the opposite party could do about it. And then voidable. How many consequences with voidable?
Typically one, because normally when a contract becomes voidable or is voidable, somebody either breached or didn't do something
You
properly.
got it. And one way this could happen is you entered into a contract with somebody that was not 18 at time of contract, not sane at time of contract, or not sober. Another way contracts could become voidable, or other ways, let me say the other ways, are, or what? I'll throw it up to you. You tell me. Do you remember? It kind of was a quick slide. But what are some examples of things that could happen while under contract that could cause it to be voidable by one of the parties? How about if there's a mistaken fact of some sort of mistake or fraud? Don't forget those things. Both of those things, examples of these things, could result in this contract being voidable. So it's not just all about 18 sane and sober. Could also be mistake or fraud. It could also be that one of the parties signed under threat of violence or actual violence. So under duress. So duress or undue influence. Duress being violence or threat of, undue influence being pressure or influence someone has over someone else. So any test question that might talk about an example, horrible sounding example of what someone might do to somebody else, here are the various ways it could result in it being voidable. You're going to enter into something with someone 18, sane or so, not 18, not sane, not sober. There's some sort of fraud. There's some sort of influence, undue influence or violence or threat of. Void, what's a good example of a void contract? Where neither party has consequences.
Court order.
Oh, that's a good point. Because if this person struggling with sanity or ability to handle their own affairs is deemed by a court to not be able to do so, now instead of voidable, it's void. Great one. What's another one? Super simple. Think old-fashioned, old farmers, just kind of, we've known each other forever. We don't need no what. Yeah, thank you, Jack. Just I'm slow to look at the chat today. So oral, verbal, not in writing, that kind of contract, handshake deal. Not why. What makes these things? When I say things, these it's about the parties having consequences. What's another word for that? Parties having consequences for their actions when it comes to a courtroom and the judge rendering an opinion. What's the judge going to ask about? There it is. Thank you. Enforceability. Is it enforceable or not? Perfect. So that's the main thing. And it can basically all be summed up to this. And I would suggest in your studies, you do the same kind of thing. Write out charts, comparisons, because this is all about comparing different things, topics, and words and terms. So the V words, easy points, but also easy to miss them if you don't really grasp it. Here are the essential elements, another thing they like to test. What are the 4 essential elements to a contract for a lawful purpose, not for a meth house or pot field? Competent parties, 18 sane sober, consideration, and mutual assent. So if you have someone who's 17, that violates the competent parties requirement, and therefore I should really say essential elements to a valid contract. I should rename this title to that. So what we have here is still a contract, just not a valid one, if they weren't 18 or all the other reasons, right? What is it? What if the test question draws out some long story between Robin and Jack, and it says Jack was under the influence of 3 pitchers of beer when he signed the contract. No offense if you don't drink. What are we looking for here? We know that it's not valid, but we would be thinking, it might very well ask, is it valid, void, voidable, or viscous, or some other V word? I'd like to throw nonsense words that start with the same letters sometimes. So you're going to be thinking, oh, voidable. That's voidable. And then the point, I think it was Jack who brought this up with the whole competent parties thing and the mental ability to handle their own affairs. Don't forget the difference between a medical diagnosis of this situation or versus when it's been escalated to a court or a judge ordering someone else to have to take care of your situation because of your inabilities mentally. That's going to turn it from voidable into void. Okay. We got into... We ended it with auctions. Yeah, so how many licenses do you need? What licenses do you need if you want to use auctions as a way to sell property? Sometimes it's right there on the screen. What licenses do you need to use auctions as a way to sell real estate?
Brokers and auctioneers.
Yeah. The broker license because it's real estate you're selling, and the auctioneer's license because you're using auctioning as a way to sell it. Does that make sense? If you wanted to use auctioning to sell cars, you don't need the real estate license, obviously, right? So it's because of what you're doing. Do you need an auctioneer's license if you want to list a property that you have listed in the MLS and try to find a buyer that way? Of course not. That's not auctioning. Do you need an auctioneer's license if you're going to make flyers and put them in a plastic box by the mailbox at the street? I'm glad we don't usually do that much anymore. So no, it's just another way to sell. Then the side note here is that the person talking fast, the one that we always think of as the actual auctioneer, is not necessarily the auctioneer. That's the crier. That's the one who is doing the talking. But it doesn't have to be that person who has the license. That person could just be an employee of the auctioneer, hired by the auctioneer to do that work. So the auctioneer gets hired by the seller because the seller wants them to use an auction as a way to sell it. And so when they're doing the auction, conducting the auction, what if the seller is super confident that they're going to get more than what they want for it? What's one method? What are the two different methods for doing an auction? With a thing versus without a thing. What's that thing? I see Zoom 103 guest. I don't know who that is, but I need you to rename and turn on video. If you're already in the room and if it's just another way to get your video working right, that's okay too, but always rename for me. Thank you. Okay, good. Because I do have to go after class and put down the number of minutes, and if all I see in the Zoom records is a non-name, then I have to do a little investigation. Thank you. Perfect, Jack. Reserve price, reserve versus not. So is it an auction without a reserve price? That's probably because the seller is confident they're going to get whatever it is they want, that it's going to be so sought after and bid against each other, multiple bids, that the highest bid wins, and they're probably confident it's going to make them happy. If they're not sure, then the safer bet is to go with an auction that has a reserve price built in, so that they know if these bids don't go back and forth and get up to at least this much, then I am not obligated to accept them. And that's it. That's all I need to know about auctions. Who can do them? License required. These kinds. These are the two kinds. Then we ended up with this the other night. We'll recap it. Buyer makes an offer for $150,000. The seller counters for $153,000. What does this mean? In this moment, the seller has countered the $150,000. What's another
Brand new
word?
offer.
Yeah, brand new offer. Another word for counter is, it's really a two-part thing. A counter offer is a two-part sort of process. It's number one, new offer or rejection, and then, number two, the new offer. So it's a rejection and a new proposal, counter offer. And don't forget, with a counter offer, don't lose track of your offerors and offerees. The offeror is the one making the offer or counter offer. So it's not always the case that the buyer is the offeror. The seller could become the offeror when they make that counter offer. So the next morning, the buyer says no to the counter offer for $153,000, and they keep looking. Next morning, seller finds out they need to move sooner than they thought. So now that $150,000 is looking pretty good to them 24 hours later. And so they reach out to the buyer and say, hey, let's add to it. In the test question, they might even say, so the seller signed the original $150,000 offer, sent it back to the other side, and communicated that they accepted it. They could stack all of these official sounding things that were done. And if that's the case, what is the status of this offer? Buyer made $150,000, seller countered $153,000, buyer walked away, said no. Seller then said the next day, oh, okay, I'll do the $150,000, I'll sign this paper. And if a burglar broke into the house of that seller and saw the signed contract on the desk, they would think let's say that burglar's in real estate school, right? They're an entrepreneur. And so they're looking at the paperwork and they see two signatures, buyers and sellers signatures, both for 150. They would just assume, oh, wow, this guy successfully got his house sold. But they don't know the whole story. Number one, they don't know that this is what happened, that the counteroffer was made, which killed the 150 offer, and that whether it was even communicated or not. They can't know that unless they hack into the maybe email system or voicemail or text and see proof of the counteroffer or the communication. We'll get more into communication with more of this type of stuff. But in this case, so they reach out to the new buyer, say they'll accept the original offer of 150. Does the buyer have to honor this 150 offer in this case?
No, they can actually counter that 150.
Sure. Yeah, they're not obligated to anything. That buyer is free to go or come back. If this is the case, I think what you're getting at, Alfred, is, oh, wait a minute. Now you want me? Well, then forget 150. How about 160? Is that kind of where you're leaning more with that? Or 155?
Well, in the case of the buyer, how about 148 now? You know what I mean? Because
well, yeah.
it seems
Sorry.
like you're pressured.
Yeah,
well,
right.
Not pressured, but it seems like you're real in the area of itself.
Exactly. You're right. I was heading the wrong direction, but for the same reason. So the buyer would say, well, we're not going to be so generous as 150. Then we're thinking 145, 148. Yeah, very well could be. So let's look at a thing that we've touched on already. We examined statute of frauds before, and we know that means a document has to, if it falls under the statute of frauds, the document must be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. And so what are the types of documents that must comply with the statute of frauds and therefore be in writing to be enforceable? Real estate contracts, leases that are longer than 3 years, not just 3 years or less, not just 3 years or more. If you see an answer choice that says 3 years or more, that's wrong. It's got to be for leases that are longer than 3 years, must be in writing to be enforceable. But Neil, what about 3-year leases or 1-year leases? Those have other protections built in that keep the tenant from having to be kicked out if a new owner takes over. So leases longer than 3 years don't have those protections. Therefore, they need to be in writing to give those protections. And then option contracts. What's an option contract? Is it unilateral or bilateral? Option contract is an example of something where one party made promises.
Unilateral contract.
Yeah. It's probably the most likely example on the test of a unilateral contract. One party has made promises. Who?
Seller.
The seller. They say, hey, I will not sell this out from under you because you have an option and you have time to exercise it or not. The buyer's got no promises made except I'll make a decision one way or the other, but the seller has to wait and find out. Another legislation that we have to know about is this one called the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. Has anybody ever signed a document with electronic signing? Just DocuSign, .loop. Maybe Adobe has a thing. I'm sure there's plenty others. We use those, particularly those first two, quite frequently in this business. ZipForm is another one. But anytime you have an electronic document, it can be a contract can be not involving paper, right? It doesn't have to be printed, mailed, scanned. It can just all be generated with ones and zeros in your machine and then set up for electronic signing, which includes a verification that this is your electronic signature and you're attesting to this and blah, blah, blah. Click here to sign, click here to initial. So it's allowed that e-signatures are binding. If all you have is a contract on the computer screen, not even printed, with e-signatures, this holds people to it. It's binding. The term wet signature is about a pen being signed onto paper, right? Because you got to wait for the ink to dry. So anytime you see wet signatures, we're talking about a non-electronic situation. But it's just as binding. Each is just as binding as the other. And we can do agency agreements with electronic signing. We can do contracts for purchase and everything. This is allowable. What makes it allowable? That's the kind of test question you'll see about this. What is it that makes electronic signing legal? And they might give you choices. The Tenant Security Deposit Act, the Residential Rental Agreements Act, the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, or the Statute of Frauds. I'm just making stuff up. Right. So UETA, Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, that's all this is, that electronic signatures are binding. What can cause a contract to go away? Our favorite one is full performance. What does that mean? Full performance, it happens on what day?
Closing.
Exactly right. Not Tuesday, not Wednesday. Well, if those are closing day, then yes. Full performance is when it's all done. And what's the E word for the kind of contract we have when everything has been completed?
Executed.
Yes. The one that agents use wrong all the time. Even 30-year in the business agents. They'll say, I have an executed contract. And you say, oh, congratulations. How much did you make since you must have closed, since you just called it executed? And they say, no. I just got it back. It's signed by everybody. We just went under contract today. And then if you want to lose friends and make people hate you, you say, well, actually, what you have is an executory contract. So don't forget those terms that can get you a couple points on the test. Another way this contract can go away is if the parties decide to just stop. Buyer and seller might say, you know what? Buyer says, hey, seller, I've asked you to fix all these things, $20,000 worth of things. Seller said, you've refused. The seller won't fix them. And the seller doesn't even want to sell anymore. And the buyer doesn't really even like this one as much anymore. A couple other listings popped up in the meantime. Now the charm is worn away because they see all the $20,000 worth of work that it needs and repairs. So it's like the 15th date. You see the wrinkles, you see the bald spot. So you're like, oh, not as fun as it was. And if the parties just say, hey, you know what, let's just pretend this never happened and maybe restore each other to their original condition. Maybe this would probably never happen. But maybe the seller says to the buyer, hey, here's your due diligence money back. But they probably would never do that. But maybe there's so little of it that the buyer just considers it a cost of doing business, and they're just thankful to have saved themselves the hassle and potential headache of a bunch of money that it's going to take to get this house up to speed. So both parties agree. But as we'll get more into when we talk about agency, they might have agreed to let each other out of the contract for sale. But what might still be an outstanding issue is whether the agents demand to be paid or not. Because we, as agents, are due the commission when we have procured a ready, willing, and able buyer. We'll get into that later. And if we produce somebody that's made an offer and offer is accepted, that sounds pretty ready and willing to me. Now for the able part. If that buyer was paying cash, not even getting financing, do they have the cash? Yeah. That's ready, willing, and able. So you might, as a broker, have a pretty good shot, if you had to, of suing your seller for the commission, even though the deal is dead. And they didn't even sell their house. They're going to have to maybe pay you your commission out of other money besides the sale of the house? Maybe. Do you think they're ever going to call you back when they want to sell it again? Maybe not. So you might want to not want to make a practice of selling your client unless the buyer's agency company, the buyer agent company says, hey, listing company, you're supposed to pay us a buyer agency fee. It's not our fault that the parties agreed to disagree and just move and let each other out of the contract. We want to be paid, because the flow of the money currently, we'll deal with what happens later. Seller pays a commission to the listing agent. The listing agent shares it with the buyer agent side, either fully or in part, meaning maybe the buyer agent is happy with everything they're getting. Maybe they want more, but in some way or another, seller pays listing agent shares with the buyer agent. And when I say all that, I mean the firms. So that buyer agent firm might say, hey, we did everything we were supposed to do. Do you know how long it took us to work with this buyer and find this property? And we showed up to every inspection and had all that extra stuff. The agent even put on the yellow hazmat suit and crawled in the crawl space and got bit by a brown recluse, and we want to be paid. That listing company is probably not going to dig into their savings account and just pay them out of the goodness of their heart. They're going to probably pass the buck and say, hey, seller, we're being sued to pay the buyer agency company. We're going to need you to pay us so we can pay them. It could get messy, guys. Knock on wood. Has never happened to me. Don't know how often it happens. I think suing for commissions happens more on commercial than in residential, probably. But all of that's possible, and it's fair game on a test. So you need to know who's capable of doing what. So just because the contract goes away because the parties agree to let it doesn't mean the commission is not still owed. I could see that being a test question. Impossibility of performance. You're supposed to sell me this house, but oops, you can't. In the process of doing the title search, the attorney discovers a bunch of liens. Now we have a problem. Or operation of law could be like bankruptcy. Seller declares bankruptcy, or there's a foreclosure, and maybe the foreclosure date happens sooner than they were going to be able to close with this buyer. And maybe the buyer's made an offer and the seller accepted an offer that's not enough to satisfy the lender. There's a whole bunch of stuff here, but these are the four main ways the contract could be terminated: full performance, agreement of the parties, impossibility of performance, or operation of law. We see this one when we talk about the topic of wholesaling. Anybody heard of the term wholesaling? I know you have. You've probably seen an ad for a course about real estate wholesaling where they make it sound like it's super easy. You don't need a license. You don't need to do anything except, well, really what it amounts to that a lot of them are teaching is finding desperate sellers and taking advantage of them to get their equity. It's really what it comes down to. Some sort of a motivated seller that has to sell because they're facing foreclosure or medical problems or bankruptcy or something, some reason that their $400,000 house, they're willing to sell it for $200,000. And a person, an investor who finds this opportunity could enter into a contract with such a seller, and now they are legally obligated, right? If it's a valid contract between the parties, that seller owes it to the buyer to give them a chance to try to buy it. And maybe that buyer decides, you know what? Yeah, I'm getting a great deal. It's a $400,000 house for $200,000, but with my trained eye and experience, I'm seeing that it needs about $60,000 worth of repairs. There's water damage, there's mold, there's bugs, there's all kinds of issues. There's the chalk outline, all kinds of problems. So I don't think I'm up for it. I don't think I want to go through all that hassle. I just wanted to hurry up and find somebody, not have to do any work to fix it up and then put it right back on the market as soon as I close on it. But I don't even want to do that. So let me just find another investor buddy who loves that kind of work, and I will just hand the contract over to them for a fee. And by assigning the contract to that person, that's what you're doing. So an assignment is just substituting the buyers, the original buyer for the replacement buyer. the assignor for the assignee. This is a topic in the current update course. Has a lot of potential for abuse, for predatory behavior. And so the real estate commission says, look, if you're going to do this, it's okay. It's allowable. But first of all, it must be allowed in the contract that you use. If everybody signs off on a contract that says assignments are not allowed, then you can't assign it. So these investors who are doing it, you better believe they come along with an actual contract they had made or they bought from somewhere that has it in there that they're allowed to do it. Our standard contract 2T allows assigning it, but requires that the seller be made aware it's going to be assigned. They have to, full disclosure, right? So agreement of the parties, unless the contract says, unless the contract prohibits it. And then even if that buyer sells the rights to this contract to someone else, assigns it to someone else, that original buyer is still liable if the one they assign it to does not follow through and purchase it. They remain secondarily liable for the performance of this contract. So it's a real world thing. When I used to teach this, it was not as often, not as commonly seen and done, but more so now. The word time is of the essence we're going to see in the actual paperwork, the actual contract standard form 2T, and only 2 places. It only shows up in 2 places on that standard form. But what does it mean? It means the date that we've mentioned here and put in this blank has to be adhered to. Time is of the essence. If it's not, then this contract goes away, dies, or something else happens. So this is a hard date. Most of the dates in the contract are not. They're soft dates. They're flexible, malleable, including the closing date. I should refer to it properly, the settlement date. Settlement date / closing date, that is not a time is of the essence date, because very frequently it could get moved and bumped. There's all kinds of reasons the closing day could be delayed. Maybe because the lender needs more time to approve the loan. Maybe because the seller needs more time to get things fixed that they promised to repair, and the buyer doesn't want to buy and close until it's done because they don't trust that it will be done if they go ahead and close. So the the closing is not a time is of the essence. How do we know what is a time is of the essence date? It has to say so. And it specifically says time is of the essence. As I look for this thing, let me find it. I'll show it to you in the actual contract. So let's look at those 2 places. There we go. Here is the standard form, and you have this in your Google Drive because you do need to look at it when we get to this part. Chapter 10 is more about the actual forms. Chapter 9 we're in now is about the basic laws. So if we go down here is the first place that, wait, no, it's up here. There it is. It's right there. It's right there in bold if it were a snake, right? We won't talk about why this is there right now, but there it is. Additional earnest money must be given over, turned in on the date you promise it will be. Why? I'll get into it just a tiny bit. Here are options. When you make an offer, you say, look, as a buyer, the buyer says, I'm going to try to convince the seller that I want to buy this property, that I'm serious, that I'm to be taken seriously. And so it's going to include the offer price in the offer. It's going to include various terms like maybe washer, dryer, refrigerator, closing date. We'll put that on its own, closing date. Maybe the closing costs paid for the buyer by the seller, and then due diligence money and earnest money. And we talked about that a little bit last week. Earnest money is a good faith gesture. It says, look, I'm so serious about buying this house, I'm willing to set aside money out of my own reach until it closes. At which point, both due diligence money and earnest money will be credited back to the buyer's side. It's that much less money they have to bring to closing. So earnest money is good faith money. Due diligence money goes straight to the seller as sort of incentive to accept the offer, frankly. The last 5 years, that's what it turned into, being used all the more. Hey, seller, I'm your person. You should pick my offer because we're the best one, and also we'll give you $85,000 non-refundable even if we don't buy it, because we're paying for the privilege of backing out if we want to. Not just 85, but could be anything. It's negotiable. So this one goes straight to the seller, and earnest money goes to the trust account holder, whoever we decide is going to hold it. What if, let's see, we have our timeline of the under contract period. We go under contract on this date, and then the closing is going to be out here on this date. And then somewhere here in between them, depending on what they negotiate, we have a due diligence deadline and a due diligence period. That's the due diligence period of time. And all this really means is the buyer needs to decide within that due diligence period if they still want to buy it. That's all it is. Do they want to proceed past this deadline date? That's the question. And what do they need to know in order to make that decision? They need to have it inspected. They need to have it appraised. They need to have it surveyed. They need to check insurance rates. Maybe it's not insurable. Maybe so much has gone wrong. So many claims have been brought against it because of insurance problems that the insurance rate on it is super high. Maybe it's in a floodplain. Who knows? Maybe they just get their uncle from Arizona, his opinion, because he bought 3 houses 84 years ago, and uncle doesn't approve it. Maybe because uncle's giving him some money to buy it with. Somebody's approval. So approval, both lender, quite likely, and also maybe family. Somebody who they trust could say, no, I don't think so. And this is how much time they have to check into all these things and make that decision. Why? If they don't make that decision by this deadline, then the earnest money is out the window. They're not getting, or they are getting that back. Sorry. Well, yeah, I was, I worded it the right way. If they don't make the decision by the deadline and they go beyond the due diligence deadline before they then decide to back out, then the earnest money will not come back to them. But if they do decide to back out while they're still within this period of time, then they get the earnest money back in their hands. It's refunded to them. So it's really more accurately called an earnest money period, although nobody calls it that. But that's the money that it hinges on. The due diligence money was out of their reach back here on the under contract date, never to be seen again. Well, kind of. Again, they're going to get a credit for both of these amounts. The buyer is going to get credited. So if they gave $20,000 in due diligence money and $10,000 in earnest money, And if all the math works out at closing that the buyer needs to bring $150,000 to the closing table between down payment and other closing costs, well, then what they're really going to need to bring is $120,000 because this amount got credited over to them because they already put it up. It'll just be given over to the attorney. It's a credit. We'll talk more about credits in the closing chapter. So this deadline, this due diligence deadline, do you think it matters that we adhere to this deadline? Or can it just float and maybe be a couple of days late? No, it's got money tied to it. Therefore, the due diligence deadline is, need to get a drum roll sound effect. There it is. Due diligence period down here. Time being of the essence. Whatever period, whatever date you put in this blank, by 5 p.m. on that date, if the buyer does not communicate to the seller that they want to back out, then when they do back out after the date, they're going to have to back out and walk away from the earnest money also. But on a positive note, if they tell the seller, look, we don't want to do this anymore at 4:59 and 59 seconds, then they do get the earnest money back. Authorization is given to the firm holding the earnest money to release it to the buyer. Unless some stuff happens that we'll talk about later. There's always exceptions. But that's one of the two places where time is of the essence shows up in this version of the contract. Another place was on that front page, and that's what I want to explain. The initial earnest money that you put up when you make the offer, they've got some choices here. If it's initial earnest money, it can be given over in the form of cash, personal check, keep an eye on the personal check, official bank check, wire transfer, electronic transfer. When? Within 5 days of when this becomes an actual contract, the effective date. So if you can't, or if the buyer doesn't want to hand over earnest money within 5 days of the effective date, then this is not the right blank to put that on. This isn't what we need to use. Not our initial earnest money isn't going to work. If for some reason the buyer wants to, instead of giving it over and giving it to the firm to hold it in their trust account within 5 days of effective date, instead of that, if they want to pick their chosen date, fill in the blank with whatever date they want, probably way far after the 5 days from the initial contract, then we would use additional earnest money. So the words are kind of bad again. We run into the kind of dumb words. We should probably rewrite some of these phrases. Initial might lead you to believe, oh, they gave some earnest money up front, then they gave some more later. But it's not necessarily what's happening. It's really about when the money is due to be deposited into the trust account. And again, if you're going to get it done within 5 days of when this became a contract, then initial earnest money is fine. I don't like to use it. If I'm taking care of my buyer as a good buyer agent, looking out for my buyer's best interest, I won't use initial earnest money. I'd rather use additional, because then we can put whatever date we want to here. But we have to put it in there by that date because time is of the essence. Why might we use this strategy? This is more of a post-licensing material, but let me just give you the scoop. What if the due diligence deadline, there we go, is reached, and it's tomorrow, Wednesday, 5 p.m. That's the due diligence deadline. If, by the way, as long as we back out, because there's too much wrong with it, we just don't like it, we don't even think our loan might go through, and we just want to make sure that we get that earnest money back. You're my buyer, I'm your agent. Hey, buyer, I think it's probably safest because there's so much wrong with it for whatever other reason. Your uncle doesn't like it. Let's go ahead and tell them no by tomorrow at 5, earlier if possible, so that you get your earnest money back and we can go find something else. You're not going to get your due diligence money back, but at least you'll get your earnest money back. But there's something required when the earnest money needs to be returned, and it's a form. And this form is called basically termination of offer of contract with release of earnest money. Even though it's in the contract that if you back out during the due diligence period, the buyer is entitled to the earnest money, if the seller decides they're mad or just doesn't want to allow it, they might not sign the dotted line on this release form. And if it's my firm holding your earnest money and I don't get a release signed by both you and the seller, I'm not legally allowed to give it to you, even though I like you better. I'm not an enforcer. We brokers can't be enforcers of this stuff. We're just communicators. Who would enforce this thing? If the buyer's like, hey, wait a minute, seller, I backed out on the day before. Sent it to you in writing like I was supposed to. You're not going to release this earnest money? Well, no, because you had too many inspections done. I don't even think that's a valid inspector and blah, blah, blah. And it was just bogus and you wasted my time. And now it's been off the market a month and I could have had a buyer and be closed by. We hear it all. That seller could get mad about this and just choose not to sign this thing. And we brokers can't do a thing about it. What could be done? Well, the buyer could sue the seller, but that's not going to happen in a day or two. That's going to take a while. In the meantime, whoever's holding this earnest money has to just hold on to it. In other words, the seller can hold it hostage. I call it holding the buyer's earnest money hostage. What if that buyer is a lower price range, lower income buyer, and this is all the money they have left? They scraped together the due diligence and earnest money, and if they can't get this money back soon, we're going to have to take a break from trying to buy a replacement house because they got to make the money back because it's tied up because the seller won't release it. Now they got to let a few months pass so they can squirrel away some savings and come up with another chunk of money for a due diligence check and an earnest money check on the next attempt. That doesn't seem too fair. And it makes me mad as if I'm the buyer agent that somebody has this power when they're supposed to sign this thing. But again, they might just choose not to and therefore hold the money hostage. But what if, and then we'll take our break. What if we could fix it so that the seller does not have that control? Hey, seller, I don't care if you sign this release or not. You can't release the earnest money if it's not even there. Because on the contract, rather than make the earnest money due within the first 5 days, heck no. Let's make the earnest money due the day before due diligence deadline. Because by that point, we will have figured out if we want to keep going or not. And so that's what this is good for. Rather than do all that and give the seller the power to not agree to the earnest money being released and therefore holding that buyer hostage by them not being able to get the money back and then try again with another house, let's not use initial earnest money that we'd have to turn in within 5 days. Let's use additional earnest money so that we can make it due basically maybe even on the same date as the due diligence deadline. Does that make sense? Even now, I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years, and back then I had to explain it to agents. They'd say, wait, I think you did the earnest money wrong. You wrote it down here. I'm like, no, I didn't. Because we're not going to give it over to the firm holding it for another 3 or 4 weeks. Wait, you can't do that. My seller won't agree to that. Well, what's it matter to your seller? I'm sure they're going to be honorable. And if my buyer were to choose to walk away, they would return the earnest money anyway. So what's the difference? Let's just go ahead and make it on this date so it's nice and clear and everybody gets it. Full expectations, full transparency. So that's why this time is of the essence, because it's such an important date in this particular situation. Kind of a deep topic there. Let's take a little break, come back, see you back here in 10.
So are we discussing the anatomy of a sales call or?
That's right.
Okay, so number one would be the pattern interrupt.
That's right.
Number two would be asking for permission.
That's right.
Number three would be uncovering motivation.
Yep.
Number four is asking for the appointment.
That's right.
And then number five is confirming next steps.
Beautiful. Awesome job.
So are we discussing the anatomy?
Charlie Kirk triggered this college student with a simple fact.
Do you believe that you have some sort of privilege?
An offensive rebound. Doncic fouled by Westbrook. Doncic upset, has something to say. Westbrook pushes him. Now Westbrook pushes Washington. Officials trying to separate him. An offensive rebound. Doncic fouled by Westbrook. Doncic upset, has something to say. Westbrook pushes him. Now Westbrook pushes Washington. Officials trying to separate him. An offensive rebound. Doncic fouled by Westbrook. Doncic upset, has something to say. Westbrook pushes him. Now Westbrook pushes Washington.
You have to watch this woman.
This country is literally destroying the middle class.
Okay, can you help me understand something else? I didn't go to an Ivy League school, admittedly. What can you explain why the word folks is spelled F-O-L-X throughout this guidebook and in other places at the School of Social Work? What does that mean? Serious question.
They don't know how to spell? I mean, I'm not familiar with that spelling.
I'm not. I don't find it a laughing matter.
No, I'm not laughing either. I think it's.
You're denying that this is a official product of the school, but this is handed out to all of you. You are aware that it's handed out to all of your students, and you're not doing anything to stop it.
As I said, it's not an official product of the administration.
Is this how Columbia University spells the word folks?
No.
Okay. Okay. Can you help me?
I asked before, would you mind talking about the because you were. I asked before, would you mind talking about it because you were much in the news last week about this issue because you were on George Stephanopoulos' show, and he was questioning about the idea that you're supporting Trump, who was found guilty of sexual assault, and you were a rape victim yourself. And I guess his implication was that being so, that you should not support someone who is convicted of this crime.
Number one, Donald Trump wasn't convicted of sexual assault. The $83 million was a defamation suit. It was about defamation. There was a sexual abuse claim, and she got a little bit for that, but the vast majority of it was for defamation, not rape, not sexual assault. So I think there are two types.
Is that right, Ralph?
That is right.
Is that right? Yes, it is.
We have a road raging driver who decided to brake check someone on the highway.
There we go. So those are the two places. We'll see it again. But the two places in our standard contract that we see this time is of the essence phenomenon, because it's so important to have that date be strictly adhered to. So not everything has it, right? As we'll, let me just flip through it. There we go. Boom. So we have other places with dates. The one for initial earnest money has the 5-day from effective date. It's not fill in the blank, but it's there. We've got, we even have the settlement date right here. Parties agree that settlement would take place on what? That does not say time is of the essence, right? Because it's so frequently delayed. There's some other blanks here. Let's see. There's a part about financing, and all kinds of provisions. It's about 16 pages still. And so we just don't see that phrase anywhere else right now. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be added if some addendum was used or an amendment. In fact, there is an amendment that could change the due diligence period or the money, the additional due diligence money, and that one of those has time is of the essence on it too. So we see it from time to time. This term novation means that we've substituted with a new contract. The old contract got canceled or terminated to be replaced by this new one so that we can, without breaching, have some replacement terms put in there. Everybody agrees, but it still has to conform to essential elements, still supported by consideration, but we're basically swapping a newer version for the older version. Maybe some additional parties to the contract have been included or added. Might be just the same ones. But that's what a novation, just think in novation in for new contract. Okay, let's talk about this thing called the parole evidence rule. Parole evidence rule says, look, you might be talking back and forth verbally originally when you're just kind of haggling and saying, hey, what do you think about this closing date? What do you think about this price? But unless it makes it in writing into the contract, it's not going to hold up in court. Kind of falls hand in hand with the other things that I just lost my phrase, but things that say basically must be in writing to be enforceable. So preliminary negotiations not admissible unless they make it into the contract in writing. The written contract rules in the event of a dispute. What got written is what wins. What if the buyer says, hey, you were supposed to leave the refrigerator? And the seller says, well, look at your contract. It didn't make it into the contract, then a refrigerator is not a fixture. What might happen if it didn't make it into the contract? It might be the fault of the agent who forgot to put it in there and everyone else overlooked it too. So it could result in an agent getting in trouble and buying a refrigerator for that matter. But the written contract rules, whatever makes it into the written contract is the thing that happens and that is enforceable. If it doesn't happen, it's enforceable. What if the seller puts in the MLS, the multiple listing service data sheet, refrigerator to be included with acceptable offer? We used to see that a lot. Such and such to be included with acceptable offer. It gives them an out. Not saying it's included, but it could even just say that it was included though, for that matter. But if that refrigerator that was mentioned in the MLS didn't get put into the contract that got signed in writing, then you're not getting a refrigerator as per the contract. Now, if again, the buyer relied on their agent to make sure it got put in there and the agent screwed that up, while the buyer's not getting a refrigerator from the seller, they might end up getting a refrigerator from their buyer agent just to keep them happy. I'd buy a refrigerator if I was getting a $25,000 commission check, I think I could afford a couple $1,000 refrigerator, keep them happy, keep them from trying to turn me into the commission. Did I do something wrong or not? Let's just not even go there. I call it happiness money. That's why I don't want to negotiate down to the bare bones right off the bat, right? I'll list your property and maybe I'll give you some sort of a discount from what I would normally charge, but it's not going to be the lowest of the low until I know that we're done, because I might have to buy something to get people to stay on track. So what else? Interpretation of the contract must be reasonable, not something crazy, firstborn child, something out of unreasonable. And the contract is taken as a whole, not just focusing like in on one word within the contract and making it all about that. It's got to be, what was the sentiment of the whole contract? What was the intention? Words are taken in their ordinary meaning. None of this legalese stuff saying, hey, it depends on what your definition of the word is, or anything that lawyers might try to pull. What is the ordinary meaning of the word? And then anything that's unclear, that is ambiguous, is going to be ruled against the one who wrote the unclear language, because maybe they did it on purpose to be deceitful. So we have an obligation as people filling in blanks and doing this stuff properly, to do it super clear, super transparent, not trying to pull any tricks, not even just being negligent or lazy or sloppy. We have to make sure we know how to do this stuff properly. It's one of our fiduciary duties that we'll see tonight, and it's called reasonable skill and care. We have to have reasonable skill and care. So all of this stuff says that the parole evidence rule says what we put into the contracts is what will be enforced. Let's talk about what happens if the parties do indeed breach. Breach means somebody is misbehaving. They're not fulfilling their promises. So if the buyer breaches, it's going to be a different set of consequences than if the seller breaches, because there's different damages, right? When we watch court TV, law shows on TV, we might have heard of these words before: compensatory damages, consequential damages, liquidated damages, or rescission. Compensatory just means, hey, what will it take to make this person whole again? They were damaged in this legal event, in this thing that happened as a result of the breach. The other party breached the contract and it hurt them. So let's award them some damages to help them get back on their feet, to help make them whole again, and that's called compensatory damages. Or in the case of a business, and somebody breached and it caused the person, the harmed party, to lose out on profits, then those damages that would be awarded would be called consequential damages. So the judge might say, I'll give you $1 million for compensatory damages and I'll award you $500,000 for consequential damages. Right? So it could be either of those things. Or the parties say, you know what? Maybe they do this in an arbitration, and they say, let's just fulfill back to where we were. Let's make each other whole again. Return to our original position. Seller gets to keep the house. Maybe they'll sell it to somebody else. Maybe they'll just keep living there. Buyer gets all their money back. The emotional part is whatever, but we're going to return everybody to their original positions. So it is in the spirit of these words, these terms, that we apply it to this real estate concept. So what if a seller, let's do it with the buyer first. What if the buyer breaches and the buyer decides not to go through with the sale? Well, we saw that in this now very messy diagram. Let me redo it. We've got our under contract date, we've got our closing date, and we have our due diligence deadline date. What if the buyer doesn't choose to buy this thing? Well, they have the right to choose not to buy it, and if they choose within this time frame, then they should get their earnest money back in their possession, right? And that's all this is. So if the buyer were to breach and say, I don't want to buy this anymore, and let's say it's not this, maybe the buyer waited until the day before closing, and this is when they said, never mind, just kidding, don't want to buy it. Well, now they're going to lose the earnest money. We'll just say to seller, and the due diligence money has already gone to the seller too. So they're losing both. These are called liquidated damages. The due diligence and the earnest money are referred to as liquidated damages that are available to the seller in the event the buyer backs out. So if the buyer's breaching the contract, they're not fulfilling their promise to buy it, that's a breach. Breach is not always necessarily like the law is coming and you're getting sued or something. But our standard contract 2T specifically says, hey, everybody, seller, you better be happy with whatever they are proposing for the earnest money and due diligence money, because if they back out, that's all you're going to get. Our standard contract 2T says these two things are liquidated damages, and that's it. No other measures available to the seller. Could there be a custom written contract that has more than this as consequences? Sure. But I don't think you'd be tested to that level. Just know earnest money and due diligence are called liquidated damages when the buyer breaches. It's all the seller's going to get. I had a past pre-licensing student who was also a post-licensing student over the years, and he called the other day, said, I tried to take your CE class, but blah, 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 whatever. He said, I had a contract, had a deal where my buyer put $10,000 of due diligence money, so gave that to the seller, but $0 in earnest money. And maybe the seller is okay with this because the seller is thinking, well, what is it that's better about due diligence money? It's immediate, it's when it becomes a contract, and it's non-refundable. So yeah, maybe that seller says, I would much rather have all of the money in due diligence rather than some of it in earnest money that I'm not entitled to unless further down in the process or unless the buyer walks. Well, in this case, I think he was the listing agent actually. They agreed to a contract with this, and it was all the way to this point in the transaction, day before closing, when the buyer decided not to buy. The seller had forgotten how happy they were to get that $10,000 due diligence money back at this point. And now they realized, oh, wait a minute, buyer's going to walk away and I'm not getting anything else? No additional money, no earnest money that I'm entitled to since they're backing out during this after due diligence period? And the seller felt some kind of way about that. They didn't like it. Why? Well, maybe that seller had hired movers. Maybe they had had a loaded up truck, and now that truck needed to be unloaded back into the house at significant expense, couple $1,000s. Maybe they even had a contract on something they wanted to move to after they sold this one that was going to fall apart now since this one won't close. A lot of reasons that seller might be mad and be angry that they've already given away the opportunity to get at least another chunk of money. So it's really important to think about this after due diligence period time and include, probably be better to have maybe 7,000 or 8,000 of due diligence and at least 2,000 or 3,000 of earnest money or something, or maybe half and half. It's all negotiable. In fact, it could be zero for both. It's allowable for it to be zero. It won't happen in this market because it's a seller's market and sellers want at least something. And then also this amount of time, this due diligence period is also negotiable. Testable questions, by the way. So with all that said, look at the one at the bottom. In the event of the buyer breaching, the seller is entitled to the liquidated damages. What are they? The earnest money and the due diligence money. Due diligence deposit, maybe that's what that DDD is intended to stand for. Let's see. Yeah. In the event of a seller breaching, let's talk about that animal. That's a little different. What is special about the seller's position? That's a very unique house. That's weird. What happened? Very special house on a very special lot. No others like it. Now, you and I both know sometimes it's very, very similar, but definitionally, right, legally, the buyer can't just replace it. Brick for brick, dirt for dirt. Therefore, what's available to the buyer if the seller breaches? So the buyer's remedies for the seller breaching. Buyer's remedies, number one, suing for specific performance. Hey, seller, you've harmed me because I was going to buy this thing, and now you won't let me buy this thing. You're breaking your promise. Therefore, I'm harmed. Therefore, I'm suing you to specifically perform on this contract. So, buyer sues the seller for specific performance because land is unique. Side note, in addition to being able to sue the seller for specific performance, what has the buyer done in these last several weeks in good faith that this is going to go through? They've spent money. How much money have they spent? So in addition to suing for specific performance, that buyer is entitled to a refund of the due diligence money, the earnest money, the appraisal, the survey, and the inspections, everything they spent trying to get this thing done. And now that seller has the nerve to try to back out and breach. So the buyer could go after all this stuff. So, on the test, what are the consequences when a seller breaches? Being sued for specific performance and having to reimburse all the costs that the buyer incurred trying to buy it. What are the consequences when a buyer breaches? The seller gets the liquidated damages in the form of earnest money and due diligence money, according to the standard 2T contract. Does that help? What about this? If the buyer breaches the contract, recap, what can be done? Buyer's doing the breaching. They're backing out.
Liquidated damages.
Yes. Can the buyer be sued for specific performance?
No.
No. Don't mix them up. People mix them up all the time. Buyer's not sued for specific performance. They don't have to buy it. In other words, the buyer can't be forced to buy it. The buyer might be forced to give money away, lose earnest money and due diligence money, but you can't force them to buy it. You can't sue them to go through with the purchase, but you could make them have to pay a pretty penny for backing out, depending on when they backed out. And then if the seller does the breaching, then yeah, they can be sued because it's unique property. We learned that the first week. Property's unique. And the expenses the buyer incurred along the way. We've said this to you a million times already. We can't practice law. So when it comes to contracts, how does this apply? The buyer might say, this contract doesn't have everything that I need it to say in there. Let's go ahead and strike through this paragraph, and I want you to rewrite it this way, broker. I want you to come up with some language that sounds fancy because I want to accomplish this goal and make it say this. Are we okay with that? Client asks us to...
No, you can't do that.
Can't
As a
draft
broker,
legal.
you have to.
Yeah, exactly. We can't draft legal language. So that's a big one. No giving legal advice either. What if they said, hey, I'm thinking fee simple absolute or fee simple defeasible? Okay, I can tell you the definitions, but I'll also refer you to an attorney who can give you advice on what you should do. All we're allowed to do as brokers is fill in the blanks of pre-printed forms. And the forms that we use, if we're a realtor, are the forms provided by the NC Realtors Group, North Carolina Association of Realtors, along with the North Carolina Bar Association. It gives us a bunch of forms that I've already shown you, at least the menu of them. So if parties want to add to the terms of an offer, not a contract, but an offer, they will use an additional provisions addendum, true or false?
True.
Offer, not contract. So anytime you see the word offer or contract, think to yourself, wait a minute, pause, put on the brakes. Let me be sure I read this right. Is this an offer situation or a contract situation? And an offer needs to be adapted using a thing called an addendum. So you're right, exactly. This is true. Offers are modified with addenda. Contracts are modified with something else. If we need to alter the contract, it's now a contract. It's no longer an offer. It got accepted and communicated. So now we are under contract. So now in order to change that, we wouldn't use an addendum at all. We would use, we wouldn't use an addendum. We would use an amendment. So this one is false. We need to use the amendment, like the Fourth Amendment or Second Amendment. Think of it that way. Think of the Constitution as a contract and the amendments as changes to that contract. That is basic contract law. So let's now take a pause from that and get over to Unit 7. Talk about how it applies and what agency is like. Because again, I think it's going to help when we dig into the actual forms, the actual contract itself, and our procedures in this state, that we know how agents are expected to behave. Here we go. All right. Okay, so we're on Unit 7 in your yellow book. Let me take a peek over here at the syllabus. And if we look in the contents, it's funny. They've got contracts and closing, and that's after agency. But then down here in the actual table of contents, contracts is mentioned here, and then agency is next. So anyway, doesn't matter. We're going to pop over and work on the first part of agency, because again, I think it's going to make it all make more sense. So I gave you a little glimpse the other day by necessity. What we're going to talk about in this chapter is some level 1 definition only. Just need to know what these things mean. Implied agency compared to express agency. Unfair, deceptive trade practices. Lead-based paint hazard reduction act. In other words, we already talked about the danger of lead-based paint. Now let's see how it's applied. What's required by us to ensure compliance. And then the level 2 here are some basic terms, some fiduciary role. There's an acronym that helps us remember what our obligations to our clients are. And then how our relationships are classified. Is it dual agency? designated dual agency, single agency, and what is our authority along the way. So let's get super historical and super basic and think about, what do they need us for? Some out there in the world would say absolutely nothing because they had a bad experience and an agent let them down. And you'll run into that, and it just gives you an opportunity to shine. You know, if you can just win them over to give you enough time to talk, then you can easily beat out some agent that's behaving improperly. And sadly, with 85,000 agents out there, not all practicing, but there are that many licenses, there's a lot of people doing it wrong. So if you just keep your promises and do basic good person stuff, you'll win, right? You'll come out ahead. But why do they need us? It involves the helping them sell, helping them buy, helping them find a rental, helping them manage what they have as an investment, auctioning, all that stuff, all this sort of thing. How did it start? We touched on this a little bit, but up till the 1950s, again, there was no such thing as buyer agency. There was no legal form of buyer representation. If an agent was involved, it would be because you went into their little shop, their little office, and said, hey, I want to buy a house. What do you have? What are your listings? And that agent in that one company would say, well, I've got 11 listings, and it's this and this and this and this. And you'd say, oh, no, none of those are good for me. Thanks, bye. And you'd walk out and go down the street to the next one and have to talk to a whole new agent at a whole different company. Hey, how many listings do you have? What are they? Oh, I got 20 of them. Okay, what are they? Nope. Don't want any of those. Thanks. Let me know if something else comes up. Text me. Just kidding. So it's that. Very inefficient. It's no cooperation. There's no MLS up through the 50s. And if a seller hired an agent to help them sell their house, that was the only kind of agency representation. Seller's agency. So if a buyer wanted to see that listing, they would not use an agent right off the bat. They would just call each individual listing and work with the agent who had listed that property. So legal representation was only ever seller agency, or a version of that called seller sub agency. So either listing agent that you're working with, or not the listing agent. And if it's not the listing agent, they're called a seller sub agent. There was no such thing as buyer agency at all. Fast forward. In the 60s, cooperation came about. So here's how it might have come about. Maybe we've got Joe down the street at ABC Realty, and then his competitor, Sam, at XYZ Realty on the other end of town. And a buyer comes into Joe's office and says, hey, Joe, how many listings do you have? And Joe says, oh, I've got 8 of them right now. Do you see anything you like? And the buyer says, nope, don't like any of them. I'm looking for this. And then Joe thinks to himself, wait a minute. Sam, yesterday, when we saw each other at the post office, Sam told me about a new listing he was going to be getting this week. And I remember because I was jealous, but it sounds like something this buyer might want. Now, Joe's not dumb. He didn't tell the buyer about it because he would have nothing to gain. All he said was, hey, sorry, didn't work out. Stop back by here. Maybe I'll have something different tomorrow. And so he calls his friend Joe at the other firm, says, hey, Joe, I got something that happened today. A buyer came in and I didn't have any listings they liked, but I think that new one you're getting might be perfect for him. And Joe would say, oh, great. Well, send them on over, because that's how they would have done it, right? Hand them on over. And maybe Sam said, I might be mixing up the names. Okay, wait a minute. You know what? I'm about to hand you this buyer. I think you should share the commission with me. If you want the buyer name, you could either run the risk that he won't find his way to your office. Let's just say that that's difficult somehow. Or pay me something. Give me just a referral fee. Let's call it a referral fee. And so maybe that's what they did. And maybe it worked great. And maybe they kept doing it. Right? Pretty good deal. Run across somebody, tell your buddy in the business about it, and your buddy pays you for the opportunity, maybe 20, 25% of whatever they make. But maybe after doing this for a while, Joe calls Sam and says, hey, I got another one. And Sam says, okay. Joe says, well, go ahead and same deal as before, the referral fee. And Sam says, wait a minute, you know what? Not so fast. While that worked great, paying you a referral fee to get a lead that I otherwise wouldn't be able to get, I'm super busy these days. Just had a new kid. The business is really taken off. I just don't have time to show this guy my listing. I don't want to go through all the stuff you have to do. I would rather just you do it. And how about I give you a higher split, a bigger fee, if you take it and run it from there. You bring him to show my listing for me. You write up the offer instead of me having to write it up between the two parties. And you kind of help that buyer out yourself. And I'll pay you more money. And it'll save me time, and we both make a chunk, and we're happy. And that would be the start of some sort of a cooperation agreement. And that would take off, and more people would see the value of this. But notice, at no point did the governing authorities, the real estate commission of the time, acknowledge it, recognize it, and do anything to officially make it a legal relationship. So even though you and I both know, if you're back then and you're putting a buyer into your horse and buggy, I'm just kidding. It's only the 60s. If you're putting a buyer in your big, heavy car, you're probably going to act like a buyer agent. I bet they were acting like it, taking care of their buyer, building the relationship, saying things like, hey, let's try to get that seller down 10 more thousand, which is probably the entire price for that matter. But, right? You and I both know they acted like a buyer agent, even though they weren't supposed to. Because that's the thing, they weren't supposed to. They did it wrong. Because how else do you make and maintain a relationship but to develop trust with you and that buyer and make them see that you're out for their best interest? But there was no legal standing to be in it for that buyer's best interest. It wasn't really official, legally allowed. We owed all our stuff to the seller. It just didn't exist. But what did exist and develop from this is a cooperation situation. And so when I got in the business in 1996, pause for some of you who may not have been born then, to think, wow, he's old. These things were laying around in the corner. Some people still subscribe to the MLS book, a catalog of listings that would look like this. Think that yellow book you have for this class, literally 800 plus pages. And you just have to flip through the newsprint, just like a newspaper, and get your hands dirty. And it had these weird, obscure terms and abbreviations that only the agents knew what they meant. And not multiple pictures, not virtual walkthroughs, just dot matrix looking stuff. Just pretty difficult, right? Not so great. And that's one thing, but think about this. What if you needed to do a market analysis and try to do research and figure out what is this listing worth that I'm going to go try to get? Well, now you got to flip to the back of this book where the sold listings are, and all you have to go on is just this stuff. Not great, but it was all they had, right? So we had a cooperation situation where, hey, if we put a listing in the MLS, we're telling all the other subscribers to this MLS that we will pay you if you bring the buyer yourself. But again, there was confusion as to who represented who, and probably a lot of impropriety of buyers assuming the agent helping them was legally entitled and obligated to do so. Then we came forward another 30 years to the 90s. 1991, there was a lawsuit, much like the lawsuit today. At the time, though, 1991, an agent showed a lot of houses, worked with the buyer, and the buyer assumed the agent was looking out for them, but realized it was not legally possible, sued him over it. And in 1995, 1 year before I got licensed and jumped in this business, Edina Realty settled 3 lawsuits for $19.5 million. We just saw some lawsuits settled. National Association of Realtors, I think, settled for $468 million. I think Remax was $55 million, and I forget the name of the other one. It was a conglomerate. They were like $83 million, and KW settled for something. This has been a lot of money. Very similar, right? Cataclysmic effect, changing the industry. So this was brand new. We didn't even have buyer agency until this point. So you might think, well, okay, so in 1995, what came about in the business? We had seller agency. Oops, that's not how you spell it. Seller. And now we had buyer. And that's not the whole story. Because what they realized the more they thought about this is, okay, now we've done it. We fixed it. Sellers can have an agent and buyers can have an agent. And somebody said, wait a minute. I know sometimes when I put a sign in the yard for sale, buyers will call me and they don't have an agent, and I end up helping them. What are we going to do about that? If we can have an agent helping the seller and a whole separate agent that's a buyer agent helping the buyer, what happens if it's one person, one firm doing this? Now we have this crazy unicorn that I would dare say 80 to 90% of agents don't want to do, called dual agency. Dual agency was also by necessity added to the mix because we had this happen all the time. Even more so now than ever, because now in the 90s, it was the start of extra online sort of promotion. And so somehow or other, it'd be even more easy for a buyer to run across your listing who did not have a representation yet. So we needed to know how to explain this and how to talk to them. So we're going to learn about seller agency, more commonly known as listing agency, and then buyer agency, but that's not the only way a buyer could work with an agent. That agent, instead of being a buyer agent, if they refuse to sign it, the paperwork, then they could be a sub-agent to the seller helping the buyer. But no matter which of these two things you call this agent, they are always this word. So you need to cement this into your memory because there's no good way to remember it that I've found. Hopefully you can figure it out. The person helping the buyer, whether they are officially a buyer agent or not, they are called the selling agent. Selling agent. ING. On a test question, if you see a reference to the selling agent, you immediately are going to think, oh, it's the one that's helping the buyer. And you're going to also think, but I need to keep reading because I don't yet know how are they helping the buyer. Are they helping them completely as a buyer agent, or are they helping them partially as a sub-agent to seller? Where are their loyalties? Selling agent does not answer that. All it says is the one helping the buyer in some capacity. Listing agent, helping the seller because sellers need to list their homes. So the listing agent's the listing agent. You might, but I doubt it, you might see this person referred to as a seller's agent. So don't mix up selling with sellers. It's all about the last letters. Seller's agent, possessive, the agent belonging to the seller with obligations to the seller. Selling agent, I'm sorry, I got nothing for you. You're just going to have to think ING. I mean, you could say, well, it's because the buyer is selling a house to them. Yeah, but the listing agent is selling their house. So again, it's like, I don't know how to make it make sense. But just force that into your memory that selling agent is helping the buyer. So recap. 1950s, one-person offices, listing. If you wanted to see a listing, you went to office to office. There was no cooperation yet. 60s, MLS, sharing, cooperation, cooperating brokers and firms took place. And then all the way up until the 1990s, they did the same stuff. Sellers were the only ones legally getting representation, but it was done improperly to the point where someone got sued about it, and they added buyer agency and, by necessity, dual agency. So, what does that mean? When I got in the business in 1996, all of the people who were already in the business were annoyed by this new development. Because think about it. If you meet a new person, a new buyer, back then, before 1990s, you would say, "Hey, buyer, glad to meet you. What do you want to see?" "Oh, okay. Well, thanks for meeting with me." "Because you had to. I'm the gatekeeper of all listings." There was no choice, right? There was no Zillow. There was no internet, for that matter. And so we had the strategic advantage. They had to work with an agent if they wanted to see a significant number of houses. We lost that in the 90s, by the way. And now it's a joke. We have nothing to do with how many properties you might have access to, unless we know of some that might come on the market. But most consumers have almost as much access as we do. So unless that's all you have to offer is opening up the house and giving them, sending them over listings, then you're not going to survive. So agents had to make sure that they were good at the other stuff too. So got in the business. These agents were upset. They said, "We want to just be able to do it like we used to. Hey, buyer, you want to see some stuff? Okay, get in the car. Let's go looking." And that was all they had to say, because there was no need to explain anything anyway. But now that we had buyer agency and dual agency, part of this new development was the real estate commission said, you better explain it all to them really soon. And so here's what you need to know. And I just saw it today. The real estate commission puts out a monthly bulletin. And in that bulletin, they print the disciplinary actions. Of course, I skimmed them before class started, and at least one, maybe two, got in trouble for not doing this, which astounds me. I'm surprised that I'm not. On the one hand, it's super simple. It's very clear, but I totally get an agent maybe in a hurry. Maybe more likely it's an agent who is scared of the discussion. Because here's what you have to do. Hey, new potential buyer client, prospect, so glad we could talk today. You're calling on the phone or we're meeting at Starbucks. Before we go further, because you just started telling me about what you qualified for or what the lender was approving you for, so I've got to put on the brakes and stop you from discussing your, follow me here, testable money or motivation. Don't tell me about what you can afford yet. Don't tell me about how bad you need to sell or buy yet in a time frame. Real motivation, in other words, because you don't know if I'm a friend or a foe yet. If you refuse to hire me and you tell me that stuff, I could end up helping the seller. Maybe I'll list a house tomorrow that you end up wanting to buy, and you told me secrets today that I would be obligated to tell the seller tomorrow. And you didn't hire me, but the seller did, and now you want to buy that house? Well, guess what? The seller's going to know whatever we talked about today by law. I've got to share it. Unless you're smart enough to hire me. Now, some of these things you don't really say out loud, right? But you're like, look, before you share money or motivation with me, your motivation, your money situation, let me explain how agency works. How do agents work with consumers? You've got some choices to make, potential client of mine. If we're talking about buying, I could be your buyer agent. I can help you access any house out there. I can find them for you, let you in. We can go look in, can do some showings. And then more importantly, once you find something you like, I can help you understand what it's worth. Well, pause, breaks, wrong word. I used the wrong word. I can help you understand what it will probably sell for, because when we get to the appraisal chapter, we brokers can't use the word value and worth like I just did. We can't say, hey, let me tell you what it's worth. Let me tell you what the value is. Not allowed. We would say, let me tell you what I think the probable sale price will be. Commission is very particular about that. They even added it to this year's update as if we didn't already know from pre-licensing. So, at first substantial contact, what does that mean? Money or motivation comes up in the conversation. Get that down. Right out to the side on your pad. Money motivation equals first substantial contact. First substantial contact, not first initial contact. So let me paint a quick picture, and then we'll take our break. You decide to hold an open house. A couple comes into the open house. You start talking to them because they're wearing a Panthers jersey, and you just went to a Panthers game, and you're like talking. A whole hour goes by, and you haven't even talked about the house or real estate at all. You have kids the same age. You have all this in common. You go to the same place of worship. You like the same team, and you went an hour, and you never had to tell them that you represent the seller yet. You weren't required to do any of that yet because you have not yet experienced first substantial contact. All you had was first initial contact. And that's not when this discussion is required. First initial contact. Hey, I'm Neil. Oh, I see you wearing a jersey. I like them too. When they start, that's eventually, right, it's going to turn into probably some trust. You've built rapport. They're going to say, well, by the way, speaking of this house, how much are they asking? Oh, it's $800,000. And they're like, oh, wow, that's too much for us. We're only pre-approved for $7. Breaks. It's okay that they just said it, but you need to stop right now and explain how agency works. And we'll dig more into that when I see you back here in 10 minutes.
And then the P stands for pivoting to what we call a no-oriented, if
Come on back together. Halfway there, guys. Midpoint of the evening. So when explaining this concept of agency to a potential client, testable question, when do you have to do it? At what point do you explain and bring up how agency works, who you represent, and how they could hire you? What has to happen to trigger this event? Oh, you're right. There we go. That's better. Sorry about that. So, what point in time are we looking for? What event has to happen for you to know, wait a minute, I need to stop what I'm doing and talk to them about agency, who I represent, how I can help them. There's something comes up in the conversation that triggers this moment, this requirement. What is that?
When you talk about money and motivation.
You got it. Another term for that, because they might use it on the test. Money and motivation is that moment of, thank you, Jack, first substantial contact. Don't let them switch it on you and say at first initial contact. Again, that's just saying, hi, I'm Jack, right? There is a point that you have to disclose who you're representing at first initial contact. That's in the event that, let's say that you're meeting your buyer at a house that you're going to show them, and you run across the seller. Maybe the seller's trying to get the kids in the minivan so they can drive away and get out of the house for you. And so you're just standing there waiting for your buyer. The seller's like, oh, I'm so sorry. You're required at this moment, first initial contact. Hey, seller, I'm just here waiting for my buyer. I'm the buyer agent. That's a case where first initial contact requires that you disclose who you're representing. Another place for first initial contact is when you talk to the listing agent of the house. Hey, listing agent, I got a couple questions for you. I'm the buyer agent, and we showed your house today at 3:00, wondering about the fence. Anytime you first talk to a listing agent or first talk to a seller, first initial contact, you need to address and tell them, disclose to them that you're working for the buyer. But setting that aside, the other thing that comes up on the test and in life, in the wild, is this moment when you're talking to a prospective client and you're looking for that point at first substantial contact. What are some actual situations that would create this? Well, how about you're talking on the phone? It's your listing. A buyer calls you on the sign in the yard and says, hey, tell me more about your listing. And is this the listing agent? Yeah, I'm the listing agent. How many bedrooms? Oh, it's 4 bedrooms. What are they asking? Oh, $395. Would they take $380? Well, you could always make an offer. I never know. Some days, maybe yes. Some days, who knows? Okay, well, I'm pre-approved for $400. Okay, sir, before we continue, I'm required by the Real Estate Commission to protect you and your confidentiality and explain to you, just make sure it's all on above board, right? All transparent on the table, all the cards on the table. I am the listing agent. I represent the seller. Anything you talk to me about until you and I might get into a relationship with an agency agreement, is fair game. Whatever you tell me, I have to tell them. So proceed carefully and make sure that you're sharing with me. I'm sure you know better and you're going to tell me whatever you want to tell me, but I'm required to give you the warning, right? Now, 2 things are going to happen. Number 1, they're going to be like, well, yeah, of course, that makes sense. Number 2, 80% of the time they're going to say, what? Well, none of the other 5 agents I've talked to this week have even mentioned this thing you just said to me. And welcome to the business. Because a lot of agents run away from this and don't disclose it at the proper time. So again, you're setting yourself apart. And you're like, well, sadly, some of my colleagues aren't doing it quite the right way. I make sure that I follow the laws and the rules. Throw a little self promo there. But first, substantial contact. Don't let them tell you confidential stuff until you've nailed down how you're going to work with them, or if you're going to work with them. The North Carolina Real Estate Commission says that brokers in charge of the firms should have a policy in writing that spells out how they want their agents to act and what kind of agency offerings to provide. What does that mean? Let me explain how I explain dual agency to someone first, and then you'll get a bit of a grasp of what it means. Then I'll tell you about this and why a firm might say, we don't even want to offer dual agency. Here's how I explain it to the consumer. Hey, seller, by the way, let's just go with sellers. We talked to buyers up to this point. Okay, seller, looking forward to working together. I really think that we would work well together, but I need to explain to you how agency works, how the agents work with consumers. And ideally, you hire me to list your property and I become your listing agent. We would probably sell it for more and have more potential buyers if we make it available to buyer agents and offer to pay them some of the fee you pay me. That conversation is going to be modified a little bit, right? And that's kind of where I'm going to go with it when we are required to in mid-July, because it was reapproved. And I'm just going to say, look, it's nothing more. It doesn't matter what somebody's opinion is about it. All it amounts to, all that buyer agency fees amount to, is one more way to draw buyers in. Just like, hey, are we going to put an ad on Facebook? Are we going to make a video? Are we going to take pictures? It's just one more. Are we going to use an auction? Don't come to me. I don't have an auctioneer's license. But just one more way. And probably the best, most effective way that's going to probably generate the best chance of multiple offers, which usually bumps that price up and up and up and up. So let's consider it, Mr. Ms. Seller. So anyway, hey, seller, here's what could also happen. The buyer might call me, reach out to me, message me as a result of my marketing efforts, because I do more than the most competition. And so if they do, I need to know your feelings on this. Here's how I could handle the conversation. Hey, buyer, you want to come see my listing at ABC Street? And you want to write an offer on it? Well, I could either remain your agent, Mr. Seller, and only your agent, looking out for you completely, 100% and only you. And I could say to that buyer, look, buyer, do you have your own agent? And they might say yes, in which case I'll say, well, have them reach out to me and ask me any questions through them. It's more proper that we do agent to agent. And if you want to make an offer, talk to them, write the offer, and they'll present it to me for me to present it to the seller. Or they might say, no, don't have an agent, don't want one. In which case you could say, okay, well then you stay unrepresented. If you like this listing of mine and you want to buy it, I'll represent the seller 100%. Don't ask me any questions about their confidentiality, because I won't tell you, because I owe it to them to keep their secrets about negotiating. And don't tell me yours. You've got to warn them. You can't just keep your mouth shut and let them not know any better and tell you stuff. That would be a smart thing to do to find out the best information to give to your seller, but it's just against the rules, right? So you can't do it. So you have to give them the warning, hey, buyer, you're unrepresented. Therefore, you don't know as much as I do, at least about the laws and the rules. I could really take advantage of them, right? But I'm not going to. Hey, buyer, you're unrepresented. I'm representing the seller. If you want to make an offer, I can actually help you put the offer together. You're remaining an unrepresented buyer. Don't tell me any secrets. If you want to tell me what amount you want to offer, I can help you with that and show you where to fill it in on the blanks. I can even provide you the form because I'm a realtor involved in the transaction. Even though I'm not your agent, I can be the resource that you will need to utilize for the various paperwork. But I can't give you advice. And I won't give you secrets about the seller. and I have to tell the seller anything that you might tell me about your secrets. By the way, don't tell me any secrets. You're going to love me. I'm going to build a rapport. You don't say this part out loud, but you're going to win them over because you're not a jerk. And they might be inclined after a couple hours of working with you to slip up and tell you stuff about their motivation. Hey, okay, they're asking 500, but do you think if we offered them 480, it would work? Sorry, seller, I can't tell you that. Or buyer, can't tell you that. I'm looking out for the seller only. So I'm not going to tell you what might or might not work, even if I knew it, because I owe everything to them. Again, we're talking about a buyer that does not have an agent, and you're not their agent either. They are unrepresented, looking out for themselves. It's like in court. When somebody goes to court and the judge says, "Who's your attorney?" and they say, "I'm representing myself." And the old saying is, he who is their own attorney has a fool for a client, right? And it's allowed. So that's one way. Listing agent versus unrepresented buyer. The listing agent can give them the forms. The listing agent can even give them some comparables out of the MLS and say, "Hey, here's the latest 3 that sold in here." If the buyer were to say, "Well, what's all these numbers mean? What does this mean for the offer I should make?" I can't tell you that. I can give you a couple of comps, but I can't interpret them for you. Not because I'm not allowed to interpret them, but I'm not allowed to do so to you. I am not your agent. You chose to not have an agent. But you could be the only agent involved in this transaction. Does that make sense? You're the only agent in sight, and you could carry this through to closing. What you are not is a dual agent. This is not dual agency. This is you helping the seller and the buyer kind of being out there on their own. You're kind of helping them along the way, because by helping them a little bit, you're helping your seller accomplish the goal of this buyer buying your property, your listing. So that is expected and allowed. But what if the buyer says, "Wait a minute, what? I don't want to be unrepresented. You seem like a nice lady. Why don't you help us both? I heard about this thing called dual agency. Can't you work for me and the seller?" And you could say either yes or no. If you have permission of your firm to do dual agency, if you have permission of your seller to do dual agency, if you have permission of the buyer to do dual agency, and if you have permission from yourself because you're okay with it yourself, because maybe you haven't been burned doing it yet, because it might very well happen. It's tricky, but all those things have to align. All those 4 permissions, your willingness and the permission of the other parties, buyer, seller, and your broker, your firm, then yeah, you could offer it. And you'd say, "Okay, well, that's this thing called dual agency. You're right. And I would represent my seller because it's my listing, but I would also represent you as your buyer agent. And that makes me and my firm a dual agent." By the way, catch that last sentence. It's testable. Write it down. In dual agency, the firm, first and foremost, is the dual agent. And then the brokers within that firm are also dual agents, unless they're not. You're like, "Oh, no, not another exception," but we'll get there. But the firm is the dual agent, meaning the broker within that firm actually doing the work, the human, is a dual agent between the parties. And now you need to explain what this means to the buyer. Okay, buyer, you know what dual agency is. Let me really give you what that means. I am working for you both. That means I can't tell you the seller's secrets. I owe them confidentiality. That also means I can't tell them your secrets, buyer. Good news, congratulations. You can tell me that you want to offer $490, but you'd really go up to $520 if that's what it took. And I would not be allowed to tell the seller if I'm a dual agent. You owe confidentiality to both parties mutually in dual agency. You with me? Also, you owe the other things that are called fiduciary duties that we're going to see on a slide in a minute. But they are confidentiality, accounting, reasonable skill and care, take care of their money and their paperwork, and have a knowledge of how to do it and which forms to use, reasonable skill and care, but also obedience to their lawful directives, and disclosure. I left one out. The acronym is old car. That's what I've been going off of just now. I left out the L, which stands for loyalty, because I do not owe loyalty to the seller or the buyer when it's dual agency. I can't. How can I be preferential, more loyal to one than the other if I'm working for both? Are you with me there? This is the time of night when people get a little fuzzy. So that was huge. How can I be more loyal to one than the other if I'm representing them both equally? I can't. So loyalty is off the table when it comes to dual agency. Which fiduciary duty do you not owe the parties? When you're a dual agent, you don't owe them loyalty. You don't owe them loyalty. Here's how this could work in real life. Okay, yeah, whatever, says the buyer. I'll just sign it. Let's just make the offer. Okay, fine, great. You understand it. Sign the papers. I'll present your offer. So I go over to the seller and I say, hey, seller, I got this offer from this buyer. Just FYI, you gave me permission to be a dual agent, and that's what we're doing here. Okay, says the seller. What do we got? Well, your asking price is $500,000. They're coming in with $450,000. What? What are you talking about? You know we can't take that. I know, but I can't tell them that, right? Well, what do you think we could get them up to? Well, see, that's the thing, seller. I can't tell you that because I'm a dual agent. And I owe them confidentiality just as much as I owe you confidentiality. Even though I know they would go to 520, I can't tell the seller that. That's big, right? Because I still owe confidentiality to both, and I can't be more loyal to one than the other. Okay, great, whatever. So basically you're a mediator. You're just saying, hey, seller, here's their offer. And the seller's like, what do you think? And you say, I can't think because I'm a dual agent here. I just have to communicate back and forth. What do you want to counter with? Oh, let's do this and this and this. Okay, hey, buyer, here's how they countered. And if the buyer were to say, well, Neil, they countered with $550. We could probably go to $520, but I don't know about $550. What do you think it would take? Do you think they would take maybe $510 or something? Sorry, buyer, I can't tell you that because I owe them confidentiality just as much as I owe it to you as a dual agent. You getting me? Do you see how the parties could very easily ask you what the other side is thinking? And you've got to make it very clear that you cannot share that. So, buyer says, oh, okay. Well, what do I do now? I don't know. You tell me, and I'll tell them. So basically, again, you're a mediator. That's all you are as a dual agent. So you're explaining this to this seller client. Hey, here's how dual agency works, and I can't be more obligated to you than them. And the seller might really feel like you owe them more confidentiality because you met them first. And it was because you had their listing that you even heard from this buyer. So don't you kind of owe more to them? Well, no, not in dual agency, I don't. If we went back to that first hypothetical where we're working with an unrepresented buyer, then yeah. If that buyer slips up, falls in love with you, tells you that, yeah, I'll offer $450, but I'd go up to $520, then you are obligated to tell that to your seller. Let's just hope for your sake that you have proof that you explained to the buyer not to tell you that sort of thing, and it was all on them that they slipped up and told you. Right? You better have it in writing. And you have it in writing by using this thing called a working with real estate agents disclosure form. That should be the first thing you ever get signed with a new prospective client. I said prospective client, not a client, because you should get this signed before they become your client. And we'll see what that looks like in a minute. So guys, that's dual agency. Now think about, let's expand on this. We decide to be it. We agree to be a dual agent. Everybody gives us permission. Everybody's like, just shut up and sign. Let's just get on forward. What could go wrong? But Then we have inspections. How'd you get inspections? Well, they ask you who you suggested, and you told them, well, these 3 inspectors seem to do a good job for my clients, so maybe pick one of them. And the inspection's done, the report comes back, and you help that buyer. You say, hey, buyer, what do you want to ask the seller to fix? And they say 3, 5, 7, 9, and 10. You know, what else should we ask for? Well, I can't give you advice. I'm a dual agent. Ugh, you pulled that on us with the price, Neil. What are you trying to... Sorry, you agreed to it. That's what this is. Do you see how it's important to explain this really well up front and probably have it in writing so you can point back to it? So when they get frustrated, potentially, you could say, look, this is not new information. I told you what this was about. I'll take it a step further in real life, and I'll say, when I'm first talking about it, I'll say, here's what dual agency is. I'll be willing to do it, but I'd rather not, and I don't think you should either. I don't think you should probably want me to do it because it's not great. It is less than. It's not as good as if you had me all to yourself. And it's not as good, whether buyer or seller, right? So, let's see. So, a firm and a broker in charge of that firm might say, you know what? I've had too many cases with the brokers in this firm who end up in a combative situation because the buyer thinks that they are maybe giving preferential treatment to the seller, maybe even downright disclosing confidential info, or vice versa. If one of the parties thinks that you're not doing it right, you're going to have some major problems. And it might even result in disciplinary action, complaints at the very least, even though you can prove that you didn't do anything wrong. But maybe the commission, and it's like, oh, let's just not. And so that's why 80-90% of every CE class that I teach, when I ask this question, hey guys, either because your firm won't allow it or because you don't want to do it, who here does not do dual agency? Most say no. They don't want to open it up. They're like, screw that. Too much trouble. Not worth it. So that's what dual agency is, and therefore the firm has the right to first and foremost be the one who gives permission or not to even allow it. So when you're interviewing with firms, there might be a question you throw out there just for fun. Hey, by the way, everything looks pretty interesting. I think I like your training program and the mentoring thing that you do and this and that. Just curious, what's your stance on dual agency? So that'd be a good time to find this out. Because maybe you want to be allowed to be a dual agent. You don't want to find this out after you've already joined the firm. The good side about being a dual agent, you're the only agent, and there's 2 halves of a commission. Well, let me say 2 sides of a commission. They might not be equal. And so you might earn both the listing agent portion and the buyer agent portion, or something close. Because a lot of times dual agents accept a compromise, and they're like, okay, if I'm going to be a dual agent, the parties, the buyer and seller say, well, I don't have my own agent all to myself. Therefore, we shouldn't have to pay the full commission that you would if there were 2 separate agents. So how about if you're a dual agent, you only take 4 instead of 6, or 5 instead of 7, or whatever. And that's a reasonable ask and something you see, and it's all negotiable. Business choice. First and foremost, will your firm allow it, and to what limits? Your firm has a say in how much you can charge, a lower limit. They don't mind if you charge a bunch. They don't mind if you somehow manage to get somebody to agree to 20% commission. That's kind of unheard of. But they sure as heck have something to say if you go down to 1% or 0% because you just like the person, right? So co-broking relationships, will they allow it? Commission splits. Splits with who? Between you and the company, but also between you and another broker in your company. If it's both of you, one with the buyer, one with the seller, maybe there's a different split. Maybe the company, the firm, gives you an incentive for selling your own firm's listing. So whatever that is, they need to have that in writing in a policy and procedures manual. And these are all sorts of things that could show up in some version, some format on the test. Okay, let's get down to some more proper terminology. When you see the word agent, you probably think of your typical middle-aged, I don't know, man or woman, agent hoofing around, putting somebody in their car, showing them property. Maybe it's like that lady from the movie American Beauty where she does the open house and she says, I will sell this house today, and whatever cheesy version of a real estate agent you might have in your memory. But put that out of your mind, because the word agent for our purposes, until you get your license and beyond, but it really just matters most now, agent is the firm. The agent, the one representing somebody in the transaction, first and foremost, is the firm you work for. And so here's where we come up with another term that we've used once before in a different context. If your firm is the agent and you work for your firm and you also work for that client, then you are what? You're a sub-agent to your firm. Just like anybody who's not specifically hired as a buyer agent out there in the world is a sub-agent to the seller. So it's two different places we see this word sub-agent pop up. This one, when it comes to brokers within a firm, are sub-agents to that firm, because the firm is the main agent, not a person. What do I mean by firm? The company. What does it take to be a firm? Well, if you decide to start a real estate firm, you could be a sole proprietorship, or you could start an entity like an LLC or a C corporation, something like that. Then you go to in that case, go to the Secretary of State website, set up the entity, LLC, LLP, limited liability partnership or company, or subchapter S, whatever your CPA recommended. Set that up, search for the name you like, the perfect, amazing name that you think is so brilliant. Search, make sure no one else is using it, and then they will issue you a Secretary of State identification number. And then you'll take that number and go over to the Real Estate Commission website and fill out an online form for creating a firm. Because if you're going to now do business in the name of this entity you've created, then that entity needs to have a license just like you do. You have a human real estate license. It needs a firm real estate license. And I just looked at the numbers of membership today, and there are 85,600 human licenses and about 17,000 firm licenses. Every firm license is attached to a human, the person that's identified as the qualifying broker. And that's what I am for my firm. When I went to the commission, filled out their online form, on the form it said, hey, Neil, Impact Carolinas Realty is the firm license name in the name of the entity you've created. Who's going to be the human tied to it who has to take CE, and therefore now the firm has taken CE because the human is the qualifying broker attached to that firm license, and that's me. Right? I'm doing it. And then they also will say, well, you also need to declare a broker in charge. And I say, well, that's me too. If I got busy and I didn't want to manage, right now I manage just myself. I'm pretty low maintenance. But if I hired 10, 20, even 5 or 2 people, I may not want to be the broker in charge for them. I might get handled too, but maybe not 5 or 10 or 20. Maybe I hire somebody to be the BIC. I'm still the qualifying broker of the firm. And when I take CE, it's considered that the firm has taken the CE, right? And I'm responsible for renewing the $45 renewal fee, paying that for the firm, as well as paying it for Neil Pender Human license, right? So that's how that looks. That's what that looks like. You could choose not to operate in the name of an entity. First of all, why do so? Why be an entity? Well, there's tax advantages. There's liability protection because you're doing it in the name of a corporation or LLC. There's also tax benefits, deductions, things like that you can get creative with. So there's a benefit there. But if you don't want to do it for some reason, you could still be a non-entity and just do real estate as a sole proprietorship, in which case You don't have to set up. You do need to have a BIC if you're really going to do any kind of business, but that's the whole world and sphere of the whole firm concept, right? So as a newly formed firm or company, you need to create policies and procedures that all your affiliated brokers have to follow so you can stay out of trouble with dual agency or whatever else it might be. So let's look at the terms. Agency is the relationship between the firm and the consumer, whether it's a client or a customer. Client versus customer. I'll give you the scoop. If you're a listing agent, then your seller is your client. And the buyer, no matter who represents them, unless it's dual agency, the buyer on the other side, represented by somebody else, is the customer to you. The buyer is your customer that you don't owe much of anything to, but your seller is your client. If you're a buyer agent, your buyer is your client and the seller is the customer to you. So it's the relationship between the parties, between the broker and the parties. The agent is the firm. Easy points to get. The firm is the agent. And then sub-agency refers to two possible different things. Number one, the brokers within that firm are sub-agents to the firm because the firm is the agent. Or the one we studied first, which is unless you're a buyer agent helping a buyer, then by default, you're a sub-agent to the seller, even if it's a listing at a different firm altogether. You're a sub-agent to all the sellers in the whole market until you're not. When are you not anymore? When some buyer has hired you as a buyer agent to buy one of them. Now you're a buyer agent to your buyer, and that seller they're wanting to buy the house of has their own agent, and it's not you. Sub-agent, we talked about. Principal and client, same thing. To you, your principal is your client. The principals to the transaction are the buyers and the sellers, right? And then the customer is the one on the other side from you. So again, if you're the listing agent, the customer to you, your relationship to a person called the customer would be you and the buyer, because you're hired and owe everything to your seller. You only owe a couple of things to the other party. And we'll see that in a little bit. So agency, we're going to dig into each of these a little more. It's a fiduciary relationship. Fiduciary, meaning the highest level of trust and obligation that you have representing someone else. Think about Jerry Maguire, right? That old movie with Tom Cruise and Cuba Gooding Jr. And Tom just bends over backwards to even keep him because he's leaving the agency he was with, and they're all making phone calls really fast to get all the athletes they represent to come with their side, one or the other. And Tom was able to hang on to Cuba Gooding Jr. So the work he puts in to doing everything he can for this guy, fiduciary is a high level of trust that you owe to your client. They should be able to trust you to put their needs above everybody else's. Get this, write this one down, even yours. You've got to put your client's best interest above your own best interests because it's your fiduciary duty to do so. You, on behalf of your firm, right? Because you're a sub-agent to your firm. So an agency is a fiduciary relationship between a firm acting on behalf, authorized to act on behalf of their respective principal. And that's what makes this business different than car sales or any other kind of sales. Insurance sales. Your insurance agent is an agent of that insurance company. They're not yours, even though they probably make you feel like it. You trust them, you call them, you say, hey, what should I do? How much coverage? I got a motorcycle. What do I need to do? And they probably know your kids, or maybe at least through Facebook. But ultimately, unless I don't know any better, but I would imagine they are still representing that company whose product they're selling. They're not really representing you in any way other than you're the one who's buying the product. Just like you go on a car lot. you know better than to tell your secrets to that person who came out there to let you do the test drive, because they clearly represent the seller. In this business, it's murky. It's a little more tricky, not murky, but tricky. And it has to be made transparent. It is our obligation placed on us by the Real Estate Commission to make it a transparency and to let people know before they engage in business with us who we represent and what they want us to do. We represent clients. It's not that we sell property. First and foremost, we represent people who want to buy and sell property. A subagent is, in this case, the firm being the agent, and the broker in the firm is the subagent to the firm. So what can a subagent do representing the firm? We can sign the agency agreements on behalf of the firm. When we get a new buyer and they hire us as their buyer agent, we don't need to get our broker in charge signature on that document. Ours is enough. We have enough authority to do that. Another subagent is this one. Oh no, it's not this one. We just said this one. But let me read it. Broker or the licensee is the subagent of the firm. The firm represents the client as the agent. So the broker or licensee represents the firm and is a subagent to the client as well. Principal, any sort of customer or client. Principal is the client. That's a better word for it. Client. The one you represent hires the firm to act on their behalf. Could be a landlord or a tenant, just as much as a buyer or a seller. This word fiduciary, again, people who act in positions of special relationship of trust. It's no more than just real estate brokers, by the way. What are some other examples of fiduciary relationship? An executor of an estate appointed by the one who died before they died, or who is just in charge of it because they're the only one left. A guardian of an underage person who can't sign for themselves. An attorney, of course, classic example of someone who owes fiduciary responsibilities. And then, of course, we as brokers are fiduciary too. We can, in this case of fiduciary relationship, stand in the place of our client, look out for their best interest above all others, including our own, protect them even from themselves. What does that mean? I once had a transaction where I was helping the seller, and it was a house that was in pretty bad shape, also occupied by her daughter and her boyfriend, and he was kind of trying to sabotage the sale, so it dragged out forever. He would be there for every showing and talk all kinds of trash, and he was basically a holdover tenant. He would not leave, and she couldn't get him evicted. She took him to court. He knew how to go about the process, and he stayed for months. She wanted him gone in January or in November. We got it under contract in January. He didn't leave until July, even though she tried to evict him. This was during the same year as COVID, so that didn't help her cause. The buyer who came along in January knew the situation, understood, look, we're trying to get this tenant out of there. But that buyer also knew, look, we're in the height of a seller's market. And if I don't just stay here and be patient, some other buyer will come along. And this buyer understood that they were going to have to compete with other buyers for anything out there in the market. It was just a commonplace thing to see multiple offers. It still kind of is, but especially then. And so she was smart enough to say, look, however long it takes, I'm not getting out of this contract. I'll be patient, do your best, try to get him out of there, and we'll close whenever he's gone. So that was a pretty rare buyer. So this was January. And then finally, my seller client who lived in, I think, Arizona, called me and said, the neighbor told me she thinks he moved out. Would you go verify it? Let yourself in, look around, see if it looks like they've really left. And I'm like, thank goodness. I might actually have a closing on this thing. I've been working it for, 6-7 months. I went in there and, yeah, it looked like he was gone. And I called her and said, yep, looks like he's gone. So we can proceed to closing now, thinking the troubles were over. And she said, well, wait a minute, Neil. I agreed to sell this for let me think, what was it? let's say $420,000, but a house that's all fixed up in there would probably sell for $480,000. And I've been sitting on this thing for 6 months and it's been draining me, and I ended up putting a roof on it and heating an air system and spent $15,000. So I don't want $420,000 anymore. I want to renegotiate to a higher price. And I had to tell her the time for that is over. We did that back in January. I'll ask, but they don't owe it to you. She was not happy about it, because understandably so. But I also had to remind her, look, if you had asked me whether you should put a roof on it, whether you should put a new heating and air system in it, I would have told you no. You didn't ask me that. You just did it and spent the money. That's kind of on you. I said it nicer. And she said, well, I don't care. I'm mad about it. I just won't sell it to him. And in that moment, I had a duty to protect the client from herself and explain to her, what you are proposing is a breach of the contract you signed. And while I won't give you advice on what you should do, I'll tell you that if a seller breaches the contract, they can be sued for specific performance. I'm in your corner. I want it all to work out for you, even though she was doubting me in that moment. And I had to make sure very carefully, I explained very carefully what the landscape looked like and not let it sound like I was rendering judgment or pushing her in a direction or mad at her or anything like that. It was precarious for a minute, but hey, you could get sued for specific performance. You could also have to reimburse the buyer for everything they've spent trying to buy this thing. And I had to let her cool off for a couple of days, and she finally did. She said, well, I guess I did choose to spend that money on my own, and it was kind of on me. I didn't really have to do that. Nobody was asking me to. And so we got to closing. But sometimes you got to protect them from themselves. If she had gone ahead and tried to back out, she would have opened herself up to a lawsuit, to reimbursement. It would have turned into a whole thing, and would have turned into as no closing. But if it had been best for her, sure, I'm all for it. But being sued for specific performance, probably not in someone's best interest usually, right? So we also frequently need to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. But so many brokers, particularly on the listing appointment, when they're trying to win over the seller and get them to pick them over the other 5 agents they're interviewing, maybe, not always, but maybe sometimes, it's so tempting as a broker to say, hey, seller, how much do you want to get for this house? And ignore what your research says. And they say, I want 600, but your paperwork, your research, your market analysis says 550. Telling them, yeah, okay, let's try 600 without telling them why that's crazy is not okay. We got to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. But a lot of agents overprice, and you might remember from week 1 or 2, a perfect example of willful misrepresentation. It's when you know from your research that it's worth X, but you agree to Y, a higher amount, right? I think the case was $225 versus $250 of a list price. So that's all within the fiduciary thing. It's a huge responsibility. We represent people in probably one of their largest transactions of their whole life. And this number, I think, is going to change after the last couple of years of competitive bids, people overpaying to win just to have a chance to getting it. But the average client buys or sells every 5 to 7 years. If you overpaid by $100,000, I'm probably going to expect the average client buys or sells every 10 to 12 years, probably. But point being, they're not doing it very often, and we aren't either. The average, not we, but the average agent might sell 6 to 8 houses a year. Out of 85,000 agents, many of whom doing this part-time, that's where you get to a number like this. If you're doing this full-time, if you're seeking out proper help and being smart about it and putting in the work and talking to people, this could be much more, 20, 30 your first year, but only if you do the work. But point here is it's a big financial investment. It deserves a lot of respect, and we got to do it right. Here's Old Car. This is the acronym that contains all the elements of fiduciary obligation. Obedience, loyalty, disclosure, old. Confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable skill and care, car. So old car. Out of this list, I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler. We owe all of this to our client. That's why it says it in the title. Clients. But we owe 2 out of the 6 to everybody else, including the one on the other side of the transaction called the customer. The 2 that we owe to the customer and everyone else are disclosure. Hey, the roof leaks. If you, the broker, knows that your listing roof leaks, you have to tell everybody, especially that buyer. It's not even your client, but your customer or their agent, really. You owe disclosure, but you also need to know how to do this business. Have reasonable skill and care. The things you're going to learn from your BIC in the first training, the boot camp, right? The first year or 2 of doing business, things you learn on the job of what forms to use, what blanks to fill in, how to do it, how to negotiate, all those sorts of things fall under this category. Let's look at obedience. Testable question. Your client wants you to only take and give them offers that come from people of the Mormon religious persuasion. What do we do? Hey, you know what? I grew up being Mormon, and I really just want to see a nice Mormon family buy this listing, buy my house. So don't even bother me. Don't even send me any offers that come in unless somebody is definitely of the Church of, what is it? Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormon religion. You would need to say to them, that is an illegal directive. I can't discriminate on the basis of protected classes, including religion. So we owe them only lawful obedience. Not every single thing they do is something we're required to do. We're only bound to follow the lawful instructions. And also, when it comes to fair housing, we could be held liable for what they do that violates it, and they could be held liable for what we do that violates it. So it's even more heightened and weighty. And if there's a fine involved because it's a fair housing related thing, triple it. Treble the fines. We'll get into that chapter later. So great example of obeying not just anything they say, but only the lawful things they want to do. Loyalty means if it's a listing of ours and it's not a dual agency situation, we are most loyal to them. We owe everything to them, not anybody else. We keep their secrets. We're their person, their protector, not the other side. Loyalty goes away when it's a dual agency situation. We can't be more loyal to one than the other when we're a dual agent. We'll get more into that again later. What else? Disclose a relationship with anyone involved in the transaction. We got to make sure everybody knows who we represent. No mysteries. That would be called, by the way, implied agency. If we're making them guess who we represent based on our actions and their interpretation of our actions, not good enough. We've got to tell them expressly, here's what's happening. Here's who I represent. Here's how this works. Here are your rights and obligations. If we want to maybe buy the client's property, we go on a listing appointment and we love it. We love the house and we're thinking, forget listing this thing. I want to own it. If we were to keep our mouth shut and let that seller think that we're there to list the property and tell us everything they normally would when they're talking to a listing agent, like, you know what, let's price it at $600, but if we could get a buyer for $550 and within a couple of weeks, we'd go ahead and take it. Then you have put yourself over their best interests. We can buy the client's property only with full disclosure and definitely make sure they don't tell you any secrets that affect their own confidentiality. You owe that to them. And we can't represent interests that are adverse to the clients without permission. What does this mean? Then we'll take our break. What if you were, let me think, a listing agent and the buyer came along and somehow or other you talked to the buyer one-on-one, and then the buyer made an offer on the property through their own agent. You're not their agent. You're not a dual agent. But the buyer says, look, if you can get your seller to agree to this last little $3,000 difference in price that we've gotten down to, then I'm buying this as an investment property. And I know you do property management, Neil. So I will hire you as the property manager if you help me buy this for the price I want, even though it's against your client's best interest because you're talking your client into it, right? So representing an interest adverse. What if you told your seller, look, this buyer said that they'll hire me as a property manager if you go ahead and agree to this lower price? As long you can do it, you can represent someone adverse to your client's best interest as long as your client gives you written permission to allow it. Right? So it's not a case of no, that's not allowed. It's a case of does the client know about it and did they give you permission to do so? And that's an example where it could maybe kind of happen. So that's loyalty. When we come back from break, we'll talk a little bit more about loyalty and then just keep on going through the acronym. I'll see you back here in 10. See if this works. I'm trying to stand up at the standing desk. Okay. Need to adjust a couple of things. There we go. Okay. So loyalty, we've talked about a little bit. Here's the other one. Again, we've got to disclose to the client, look, this could hurt you. Could result in some kind of injury to you. Therefore, you need to get some advice that's not me. My advice is this could harm you. As to anything further, you need to talk to an attorney, right? So point them to an attorney if we're thinking, like my seller client who was thinking about breaching. I had to say, look, talk to an attorney so they can explain the depths of what getting sued for specific performance looks like. So that's the O and the L. Let's talk about disclosure. We owe this to everybody, including the customer, including the general public. If you're in line at the Food Lion, somebody says, "Oh, you're the listing agent for that house over there," you owe it to them to tell them the roof leaks. That's how much you owe disclosure as a broker. Anything that affects the marketability or value of the property. Anything down the road from the property. It's near the landfill. Anything about the party's ability to complete the transaction. Oh, hey, seller got a foreclosure notice in the mail. So if that's the case, you have to disclose it. Even that. And then anything they care about is a material fact as well. And if you know those things, you've got to disclose them. The ability to complete the transaction, foreclosure notice for the seller, maybe if they're going to declare bankruptcy, that's something that need to be disclosed because it affects them selling the property. And then for the buyer, what could we find out about the buyer that we would now owe to the other side that could affect the buyer's ability to perform? What are we looking for? What are we worried about when a buyer is thinking about buying the house, working toward buying the house? What is that the main question? Most of the time when somebody buys a house, it's not cash. And so the question
Whether
is,
or not they can get the loan.
yeah, did we get a loan approval, conditional approval at least during the due diligence period? So that's probably the most frequent one. Here is the basic disclosure form for residential property sales in North Carolina. And it's called the Residential Property and Owners Association Disclosure Statement, or RPODS. A couple things about this document. We, as the broker, cannot fill it out for them, even if they can't see, like me. Because if I try to fill this thing out, not only am I not allowed to, it's hard to see the thing. I don't know if you can tell, but there it is. The print is pretty small. Here's what it looks like. It's 4 pages. It's soon to be bumped up to 8 pages. They're going to add 4 more questions, but the main thing is they're going to make it larger, reformat it, make it easier for people to read. A couple things about it. On the very first top of the page, first point, it says the following situations do not require this form. So everything has an exception. And one of them that they mention is, well, first of all, residential real estate, single family, condos, townhouses, and buildings up to 4 dwelling units. By the way, anytime we're talking about multifamily units, 4 or less falls under the residential classification. 5 or more is considered a commercial property, by the way. So what type of house sale, property sale does not require this document? Here it is. A disclosure statement is not required for some transactions, including the first sale of a dwelling never inhabited before. New construction does not require this form because it's new, right? No problem understanding that probably. And then the only other one they have listed is this one. Residential property pursuant to a lease with an option to purchase, where the leasee occupies or intends to occupy. If you have an option to purchase and you're renting it, living there currently, then you already know. You're already using it, occupying it, so you don't have to be given the disclosure. Here's the other one. There's about a dozen. And so anytime you see a GS reference like that, you can just literally copy it and stick it in Google, and that will pop up as a pretty quick result. And there it is. It's North Carolina General Assembly General Statutes. And here they are. You don't need to know all of these. I'm just kind of showing you a couple of them. First, new construction does not require that RPOS form. What else? Foreclosure doesn't require the RPOS form because, again, the bank is saying, look, we took this back from somebody who didn't pay their mortgage. Therefore, we never lived there. We're not going to give you any insight as to what's going on there because we don't know. We never lived there. My favorite word in this whole document is transfers made solely to a spouse or a person in the lineal line of consanguinity. What? Blood relative, basically. Oh, and spouses from a degree of divorce. Okay, well, you were married, so you were a co-owner, and you knew everything there was to know about it probably because you co-owned it, but now you don't. They bought you out and you went away. Well, they didn't have to provide this form to the one that goes away, right? Or the one that buys it. Sorry, the opposite. The one who gets to keep the house doesn't have to be given this form because, again, they were already the owner. Just now they're the single owner. So let's see. Here we go. Oh, no, I want to show you that form. Let's take a look at this a little bit more. If we move on down, let's just get the 30,000 foot view. First page is basic instructions and where we sign and write the address. But 2 through 4 look like this. A whole bunch of, here's what I know about it. Like this. Are there any problems, malfunctions, or defects with the foundation or otherwise? And here are the 3 main choices. I think we've talked about it before. The seller can say, yes, there are problems. Check yes, the box yes. Or they could say, no, there's no problems. If they know there's problems, they can't check no. That's a lie. That's fraud. Not okay. But what they could do if they know that there's problems, like a leaky roof, is to say neither thing. Yet neither yes nor no. They could check the box for no representation. The seller has this option. But if we, the broker, already know that the roof leaks, even though the seller can still check no representation, we have to disclose it some other way. We have to disclose it some other way. We can't use this form. We can't fill it out. We can't take it from them and help them and check the boxes for them. We can give them verbal guidance. Hey, here's what this means. But we can't fill it out for them. Put pen to paper is not allowed for the broker. This is only for the sellers to fill out. And it's just this. The whole first page is basically about the dwelling, anything from septic tank to roof to water supply. Then we get to the second page, and they start talking about foreclosures and bankruptcies and financial related things and flood zones. If a yes was answered to any of the questions, there's a tiny little spot here to say what those details are. Here's yes to number 14. Here's the scoop, right? And then halfway through the page 3, if there is an HOA, homeowners association, this is where we would talk about it. Tell us more about the HOA. Who is it? Who do we make the check to? How much are the fees, the dues? Who's the president? What's the website and the phone number? So that the attorney can get this information and do what they need to do to get the financial stuff. So they know if the seller has paid their dues up to date, or if they need to collect dues from seller and send them in along with the buyer's remaining part of the year, whatever it might be. And then this last part of page 4 says some more financial things like, is there a goodbye fee? In other words, some HOAs got really smart and devious, and they say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. Now pay us $500 to be the new kid. Or they say, hey, sorry to see you go. Now pay us. Sometimes they're charging the seller for leaving and the buyer for coming. And so what are those fees? Many times when I ask the seller any sort of fees in connection with transferring the property, they don't know. And so I want to go ahead and get this thing listed, and I'll say, well, then just check no representation and we'll find out later or never. And we'll just let the buyer do it. Let the buyer figure it out on their own. I don't know either. And I could make a phone call tomorrow, but I don't want to hold a whole thing up over it. So the other part is unsatisfied judgments, special assessments, dues and fees. In other words, is the HOA in financial trouble? Because many times they are. HOAs are run by people, human people. People have a nasty habit of being human, and they do things wrong sometimes. And then the last one here is, okay, well, how much do those fees cover? What are those things that covered by the fees? Management fee, yes, no representation. Master insurance policy, trash removal, common area maintenance, water, sewer, cable, internet, parking, road maintenance, all that stuff. This is the RPODs. And again, it's about to double in size to 8 pages, but at the benefit of being larger print. 4 more questions. I think, like, you don't need to know them. I'm not even going to mention them. So that's this required disclosure. Does the seller have to provide this? Yes, unless it's one of those exempt situations. Could it say nothing of value? Yes, it could be completely worthless, not worth the paper it's written on, because the seller could check no representation for every single one. What kind of seller is going to check no representation for this whole or anything, but maybe even the whole document? In what case do you think you might choose to do that option?
If I was flipping.
Oh, say flipping? And you just really don't know one way or the other? Yeah, that's smart. As an investor, that's really good. Sort of like someone who never lived there. Yeah. How about an attorney? Someone who did live there, but they're so tuned into litigation that they're like, if I can get out from under liability, I'm going to do it. Sometimes we see that. Usually my line is with this. I'll say, look, sellers, you could certainly check no representation. What's that going to do if a potential buyer sees a bunch of no rep? They'll probably wonder what's wrong with it that you're hiding. I'll wait for them to answer that. And then might be best practice. Let's see what we can check no to. If it has to be a yes, maybe it's something you're willing and able to fix, so it can turn into a no. But yeah, seller, you have every right to say no representation. Just don't tell me what you want to say no representation about that you might know something about. Because if you disclose to me that the roof leaks, you can still check no representation, but I have to tell them. Where do you think I, as a broker, what way would I tell this and disclose the roof leaks? I can't touch this form, so how else could it be disclosed from me if it's me doing the disclosing?
In an instance where the home was inspected and maybe you had first contact with the inspector.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's how I could find out about the material facts, maybe. Sure. But when I do know a material fact, what method, what avenue would I use to tell the other side that I know something, what that thing is? If I can't use this form, because I'm not allowed to fill this form out, I can't strike through something I know is wrong. I've got to provide the form that the seller has filled out, but I still have to disclose that the roof leaks and that there's a significant amount of mold. So I would probably use the MLS. I could just put it in the MLS as an attachment, depending on how big the document needs to be, or just a little blurb in the description of the property. Or not even that, but just everybody who sees it, I could send an email to the agent. Or anybody who makes an offer, I could send an email to or text, right? I just need to make sure in some way I convey that information. Main thing is we as the broker can't fill it out for them. We can give them advice, tell them what their responsibilities are. We'll get a little more into that later. Confidentiality, exactly what you think. Keep your clients' secrets. You know your seller wants to try at 450, but they take 420. You can't disclose it without your seller giving you permission to. Wait a minute, what? Why would they give you permission to do that? Have you ever seen a description online in the property? It says motivated seller. So basically you're telling me the price advertised is not the price. You just said motivated seller. So what I'm looking at is the price will be improved. All I have to say is I hope you had permission from your seller to say motivated seller. Can you say it? Yes. But you need their permission. So we can disclose confidential information, but only with their permission. So if the test question says, you know that the seller is willing to sell for $20,000 less than the asking price, and that they are willing to include the waterbed, are you allowed to tell those things? And the answer choices are no, you're not, or only with permission of your broker in charge, or only with permission of the seller. The answer being seller's permission. It might be that your seller says, look, let's put it on the market for $650, and I definitely would come off of that. I just don't want to scare away any buyers either. So let's go ahead and also tell them that I'm negotiable, or I'm a motivated seller. Get that in writing. You don't want them to ever come back to you and say, you shouldn't have told him that I said I was motivated. You want to have that permission in writing. Accounting, we've got to keep records for 3 years after the transaction is finished. We have to keep accurate records, and that includes the communication between us and other brokers, the client, emails, text messages, anything they've signed, agency agreements, listing agreements, buyer agency agreements, addenda, amendments, all 83 of the competing offers. That's not the norm, but there was one I heard about that was however many offers you get, you got to throw it all in the file. That's a pretty thick file. Good thing it can be electronic, right? Get a good scanner, turn all those dead trees into PDFs and save them that way, or maybe have both and just have redundancy. Have the PDFs saved on the cloud maybe. They don't care how you do it. You've got to just keep at least one version of accurate records for 3 years. We see the word 3 a lot in this business. 3 years after the transaction is over with. We've got to keep these. Probably good to be redundant. And probably, by the way, good to keep longer than 3 years, but the commission only requires 3. What if there's some sort of a crazy lawsuit 5 years, 10 years later, and something in your files helps you get out of trouble or avoid trouble altogether? Not a bad idea, especially if it doesn't take up anything more than just some gigabytes to just keep it. But this is the testable thing, 3 years. Accounting also says we can't commingle in a trust account. If we have a firm trust account, we can't put other people's money in with the firm's money or our own money. There is a current case study in this update course where the buyer was instructed by the agent to send the due diligence money to the seller because it's supposed to go to the seller once we have a contract. But they told him, do it by Venmo. Venmo the $1,000 due diligence fee to me as your buyer agent, and then I'll give it to the seller and Venmo it to them. So the problem here is what? Venmo is not a trust account. Venmo is the account of the broker. We just parked someone else's money in the broker's personal account, big time commingling, right? So not okay. We could have Venmo'd straight from the buyer to the seller. That'd be okay. Or write a check, buyer writes a check, you deliver it to the seller. We got to keep it separate to avoid commingling. If you're a provisional, or while you're a provisional broker and you get a check for earnest money and a check for due diligence money, you can't hang on to it for any real amount of time. You're just a delivery person. So let's say they write it to you because your clients are heading back to Oklahoma. You can't just park it in the file and carry the file around for a couple days. As a non-provisional broker, you have some leeway there. But as a provisional broker, as soon as they give you the check and it's a due diligence check, you either need to deliver it to the seller, or if the offer hasn't been settled yet, they went ahead and wrote you the check, let your BIC hold it. Brokers in charge have to hold money that PBs are interacting with. Provisional brokers can't. A lot of times those two checks aren't even collected, or maybe not even written, until the offer becomes a contract, gets communicated. Now we race around and go get those checks from the client and then take them to the right place. But occasionally maybe the person's going back out of town, they're making the offer, let's go ahead and just give me the checks while you're here to eliminate the hassle later, in which case as a provisional broker, you would need to deliver them to your BIC ASAP. Accounting also has to do with compensation, accounting to your client and all the parties in the transaction for whatever it is you're making. You can't hide your commission, your compensation, that you're making a bonus, because sometimes in new construction, the builder will say, hey, buyer agent, if you bring us a contract by the end of July, we'll give you a $10,000 bonus. That's more in a neutral to buyers favored market. We're not seeing that so much in this seller's market. The bonuses went away and the commissions seem to have dropped from builders. But any incentive, any bonus, including Panther tickets that you might have been promised by a seller because you brought an offer, whatever that thing of value is, everybody knows, especially your client. Everybody needs to know. Has to be disclosed. And then finally, reasonable skill and care means you know what you're doing. And you're not done just because the contract gets signed and communicated. You still have probably even more to do, right? Finding the house, getting it worked out, negotiated into a contract is half of it or less. Now you've got to, as a buyer agent especially, drive the boat about inspections and appraisal and survey and meet people at the property. And you might be the only way to get the repair quote. As a result of the inspection report, looks like we need something fixed. So let's see how much we need to ask for to get it fixed. So let's get some repair quotes from some vendors, and that's on you to meet them out there and let them in. It's not on the listing agent to do this. So we're not done with that contract unless you hire a transaction coordinator, but your obligation, your responsibility falls on you. And then reasonable skill and care also applies when we are the only agent. Remember that case about working with a buyer where the buyer is unrepresented? We still need to help an unrepresented buyer because by helping them, we're helping our own client accomplish their goal of either selling the house or buying the house. So we could exercise reasonable skill and care helping that unrepresented buyer buy our listing. We could also exercise it helping our buyer buy a for sale by owner. Sometimes in this market especially, sellers say, I don't need an agent, I'll sell it myself. They put a for sale by owner sign in the yard and the buyer calls you and says, I know you showed me 10 houses yesterday, but I found one. Why can't you look it up for me? And you look for it in the MLS. It's not there because it's not a listing by a broker. It's a for sale by owner listing. And you can help them. You can help your buyer buy a listing for sale by owner. It's just that you need to do it a certain way. You need to approach that for sale by owner seller, basically an unrepresented seller, and say, look, I have a buyer who might be interested. I need to come check your house out. Would you pay a buyer agency fee if the offer made sense? And they may say yes or no. Early in the process, they're probably less inclined to say so because they're more optimistic. But once it goes out 3, 4 weeks, 5, 6 weeks, they're not feeling so great. And now it's really starting to infringe upon their normal life. They're really starting to reconsider. Maybe I'll list it because I don't want to do all this and have the showings. But if you end up being a buyer agent helping your buyer buy one with an unrepresented seller, you're the place the seller is going to get to lean on for the disclosures. you still need an RPODS disclosure because a for sale by owner is not exempt from the disclosures. Unless it was a new construction property, I guess. But so they're going to need you to provide the forms. And the next question I usually get is, do you get paid extra for that? You're not a dual agent, but you're doing more work. Well, you might or you might not. Depends on how good you are at negotiating. Depends on the process and the parties, and you may not. You may just be lucky to get the original buyer agency fee that you were hoping for, even though you're doing a little bit more. Maybe having to meet the seller, have some one-on-one talk with them, explain the offer from your buyer to them, justify it, help them understand how you came up with the numbers, and help them understand what they're going to walk away with. Hey, seller, if you take this offer, here's your net sheet. Take this offer, you got to pay this, this, and this. Here are the typical fees, and here's what you'd walk away with. Whatever it takes to make this transaction happen in your own buyer client's best interest is going to require you to do some stuff for the other party. Okay, here's the part about customers again. So we have a tennis court with the net in between. And we owe two things to that person on the other side of the court. My graphic of arrows, or I think it was arrows, went away. So this buyer agent up here is helping the buyer, their own client, on the same side of the court. Maybe we'll make it relevant and call it a pickleball court. And then over here we have the listing agent helping the seller. So to the listing agent, the seller is their client. To the listing agent, the buyer is their customer. What does this listing agent owe to this buyer? And what does this buyer agent owe to this seller? The last two letters of the acronym, old car. They owe reasonable skill and care, which is also honesty and fairness, and they owe disclosure of material facts. So that's the broker's duties to the customer. Keep in mind, these are the broker's duties to the customers, not the seller's duties to the customer. Because you might also see the phrase in your reading, let the buyer beware. The Latin term caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. But it's not let the buyer beware of the broker. It's let the buyer beware of the seller. Because the seller doesn't owe them any disclosure for the most part. They can check no representation on the disclosure. So our duties is what we're talking about. What do we owe and to whom? We owe every bit of old car to our own client. We only owe the last two letters to the customer and to third parties. Honesty, fairness, reasonable skill and care, and disclosure. Are we okay there? So we have to disclose all material facts to everybody voluntarily. Don't make them guess. Don't make them ask. Be proactive, no matter who we represent. That's what we owe. We're held to a higher standard because we know the laws and rules better than the typical person. Let's talk a little more about material facts. Got some nice graphics, some lovely pictures. What is a material fact that you owe disclosure about? The property. I always think about the leaky roof. So number one, that's probably a pretty leaky roof. Or maybe in my case, 2 miles away is a landfill. I don't ever smell it or see anything weird except the trucks in the distance from the end of the road. But the ones who live near it might smell something. And if it's down the street from this property, you, the broker, owe it to discover and disclose it. It's not enough to say, well, I didn't know about that landfill. You've got to do enough research to know what's going on. It's not just disclosure. We owe it to discover and disclose. The ability of the parties to act, we talked about that, like a foreclosure notice. By the way, what if the seller is 3 months behind on their mortgage payment? Is that a material fact that must be disclosed? No, it's not. Behind on the mortgage payment, not a material fact. Foreclosure notice and a date has been set for the court hearing, yes, material fact. Here's another one we'll get more into when we get to the finance chapter. What if the person is behind on their payments, and they can't catch up, and the market has shifted, so the property, even if they sold it, wouldn't be enough for them to pay off their loan. That would be a case where we might use something called a short sale. You ever heard of a short sale? I'm looking at heads, looking for nodding or shaking. A short sale is a way to avoid foreclosure. And with a short sale, a seller is upside down, meaning they owe more than they'll get if they sell it. And so they need to ask their lender's permission. Hey, lender, property values have tanked. I owe you $200,000, but I can only get it sold for $160,000. Therefore, if I get it sold for $160,000 and pay you that, maybe minus some expenses, if I give you $150,000, even though I owe you $200,000, is that going to be enough for you? Guess what? The lender is not going to hurry up and give you the answer. So a short sale has nothing to do with the speed of the transaction. It's about short of the amount owed. You have to wait and ask for permission. Wait for that permission to see if you can sell it and pay them less than what you owe them. We'll talk more about that in the finance section. But if the seller is seeking a short sale approval, that is a material fact. We have to disclose it. And then anything that they care about is also a material fact, like termites. If it's ever had termites, we don't want to buy it. Or pet allergy people. Oh, it ever had pets, dogs, cats, I can smell it from 12 years away, then I'm not buying it. So just because they feel that way makes it a material fact that we, as a broker who knows the answer, has to disclose. So there it is. Property itself might be radon, might be broken things, might be mold or plumbing leak, structural, mechanical. There's the down the street. I've got a drag strip down the street. Thank goodness we don't have a hog farm, but some parts in the middle and eastern part of the state do. Landfills, an airport, air traffic, zoning laws and zoning changes, ability to complete, buyer's loan not being approved, foreclosure notice or bankruptcy from the part of the seller, but not if they're only behind on their payments. And then anything they care about. Maybe they don't want to be in an HOA neighborhood or ever flooded or ever burned. Property was in a fire. Could affect structural integrity. Let's see a structural engineer's letter to verify that it's still okay. Okay. There are 3 issues that have to be disclosed. I just told you that the seller could say no representation. But there's 3 situations where the seller cannot decline to answer. 3 of them. 3 material facts that must be disclosed. And the first has to do with siding. Very particular kind of siding called stucco, synthetic stucco, not hard coat. So real stucco is called hard coat stucco, and it has like a gap behind it between the interior walls of the house and the stucco siding has sort of a weep hole gap area of air. So if moisture got behind it into the walls, it would have a way to get out. But synthetic stucco, also known as EIFS stucco, I never know what that stands for. It's built differently. It's all sandwiched together like this. There's no weep hole space. There's no air space. So if moisture gets back in there, it's just going to stay there for a long time and have trouble drying out until the point at which rot has started. Maybe termites were drawn to it because now they have food and water. Wet wood is food and water to termites. Mold. And over time, this is sort of like house cancer. You couldn't see it because of the stucco, but eventually you maybe saw a little glimpse of a dark area near the corner, some water damage, and then you started picking it apart and all of this was revealed, right? Or it might be something like over here. One thing about stucco is the features of it over the doors and windows oftentimes jut out from the wall about an inch or so, creating a 90-degree angle. And that crease needs to be kept waterproof. Keep a nice bead of caulk there so water that might land on top of these doors and window frame areas doesn't just seep down in. And that's the hard part. First of all, when this first came into the market in the 90s, I guess, builders weren't building it right. They weren't sealing it properly, and owners didn't know how to maintain it, didn't know every few years to check and make sure that there wasn't cracking formed to allow water to go in, and that's how this happened. So here's the exclusion. Here's the exception. Synthetic stucco being on the house, even if it's as bad as this, let's say the seller said, you know what, I am tired of this mess. I'm going to go ahead and drop $150,000 and get them to peel every bit of synthetic stucco off of this house, and I'm just going to put up siding in its place, like vinyl siding or hardy plank or maybe even brick. And so there's not a scrap, least little bit of synthetic stucco left. But even if it's all gone, the fact that it used to be there, still a material fact that must be disclosed. So synthetic stucco, even if repaired or replaced, has to be disclosed. No way around it. Another one is this stuff. If you've ever looked under your sink or looked in a crawl space of a house built in the 80s and 90s, you might see gray water pipes. They might even have gray fittings instead of those brass fittings there on the right. That's even worse because the fittings seem to develop leaks even worse. For some reason, this material called polybutylene, this gray stuff, sometimes would develop pinholes from the chemicals in the water coming from inside the tube, would create weaknesses over time and sprout these little pinhole leaks. And that's great if you can see it when it happens and fix it right away. But if it's hidden in the walls and it has time to just accumulate and rot and then create mold and rot, obviously the problem, big problem. So again, leaking polybutylene pipes that have ever leaked, even if they've been repaired or replaced, the fact that it had polybutylene pipes that leaked at some point is a material fact that must be disclosed. Here's the wiggle room nuance of this. Test question. House on ABC Street. Potential buyer looked in the crawl space, saw the gray pipes, confirmed with the inspector they were polybutylene pipes. Is the seller required to disclose the polybutylene pipes in the crawl space?
Yes.
The answer, because I'm all about the trick questions, the answer is we don't know enough information because we need to take it a step further and say, have they ever leaked? Because it's only polybutylene pipes that have leaked that has to be disclosed. That's the tricky point about this question. Not that it has it, that's not a material fact. Just because it has poly pipes, not material. If they've leaked, now it's a material fact. You might be thinking, well, how in the world would you know if it's been fixed or replaced? Well, that's part of the challenge. But one way you might look into it, you know the house was built in the era that they might have very commonly used it, like in the 80s and 90s. And maybe, remember in the insurance chapter, we talked about a way that the insurance the insurance company, when they decide to give you the policy, they check the history of the property, and it's called the clue report. So if your client is worried about this issue because you know it's in the era of these pipes, you might even see them because you peeked in the crawl space. You might want to say, hey, listing agent, please have the seller pull their clue report, comprehensive loss underwriting exchange. Let's take a look and see if sometime over the last 7 years there were any major claims against the property for water damage, for polybutylene. The damage that would be caused by this, probably covered by your insurance. But do you want to just fix the 6-foot section that got the leak? Or are you worried about the rest of the house? You probably want the whole house replaced, don't you? Guess what? Insurance isn't going to cover that. They'll cover the damage part. Then you can either wait for more damage to happen, or you could be proactive and drop 20, 30, 50 grand and replumb your whole house. So all kinds of fun extra things that might pop up in some of this stuff. So again, poly pipes is not the issue. It's whether they've leaked. That has to be disclosed if it's known. And then finally, my favorite one. Anybody watch Breaking Bad? What am I going to be talking about? Breaking Bad, Walter White. If it was ever used to produce methamphetamine, it creates these nasty toxic chemicals that can leach into the drywall and the whole interior and get in your bloodstream and infect people basically and cause toxicity issues. So the fumes seep into the walls. There was a case where a pregnant lady rented a place for somehow or other. She was tested for drugs and came up positive for meth, and social services was called because she was pregnant and possibly harming her baby. But come to find out, she had nothing to do with drugs. She had just moved into a rental the last couple of months, and because it had been used as a meth lab, she had breathed in the chemicals enough to read as testing positive. The good news, happy ending is, didn't affect the baby. They got to the bottom of it. They didn't have to kick her out or arrest her or anything. It all came to light and she was okay. But that's how nasty this stuff can be. So if you know that the property was used to cook meth, material fact automatically, period. How do you know? I don't know. You might know because some neighbor mentions it or you just run across it. Is there a fancy test? Probably. It's not something you see regularly. If your client's worried about it, then absolutely you need to do some research, figure it out. And maybe there is some sort of a meth test like there is a radon test, but I've never had to interact with this, so it hasn't mattered to my clients so far. But there's no official requirement except if you know it, you have to tell it. We saw some of this stuff in the comments section, so we are kind of crossing over because keep in mind the comment section is the laws and the rules. Now we're seeing how those things apply to the issue of agency, right? And how it falls onto our shoulders. So here's the big one. Don't forget what I think pages maybe pages 5 through 9 is these things. Examples of willful misrepresentation, negligent misrepresentation. Did you do it on purpose and tell the wrong answer on purpose? Or did you do it because you didn't know any better because you didn't bother to do your homework as you should have? Willful versus negligent. And you said a wrong thing, that's misrepresentation. Or you should have said something, but you never mentioned it, that's omission. Did you do it on purpose because you were hoping they wouldn't ask and you wanted to hide something? Or again, did you do it because you didn't want to bother to check and you were kind of lazy or slack? So knowing the difference, they'll give you a scenario. You'll have to identify which of these it is. Willful means we knew about it. Negligent means we should have found out about it. And then misrepresentation. Willful misrepresentation is just straight up lying, just a lie. Omission is not saying something when you should. Okay, 3 more types of properties. These 3 are not material facts. It is not a material fact that a broker is required to disclose when we know that the house is haunted. Anybody ever been to a haunted house? I hear the rules are totally different in Hawaii. And not only do they have to disclose it, but the house tends to be worth more if it is haunted. Who is with me guessing that there's a lot of haunted houses claimed to be in Hawaii? Maybe. But different here. We don't have to disclose it. Even if we saw the ghost rattling the chains, not required. It's a stigmatized property. Sometimes people ask, but I don't run into it a lot. The one on the far right, and then we'll talk about the middle one. The far right, if somebody's ever died. Did I tell you my death in the listing story? I might have. My childhood friend who died in the house. Not a material fact if somebody died or committed suicide in a property. Who would care? Anybody here don't want to live in a house that somebody died in? You find out somebody died, are you going to still buy it? Just curious. Thumbs up. I'm all about it for the right price. Yeah, you're okay with that? What about haunted? Still okay? Maybe. We as brokers don't have to disclose it. If they ask, we have two choices. We could say, basically, I plead the fifth, or some version, hey, I'm not going to answer that question. We could decline to answer it. If we do choose to answer it, we can't lie about it. Got to tell the truth or say nothing. But we're not required to even bring it up. Here's a nuance to that. If the person died because of AIDS or HIV, then not only are we not required to disclose it, we're not allowed to say somebody who lived here died of AIDS or HIV. Why is that? It falls under the what?
Protected class.
Yes. Handicap, disability, can't disclose it. You could say they died there, but you couldn't say that they died of AIDS or HIV. And then the middle one is probably the most problematic to understand, and I am right there with you. What if the listing is across the street or next door to an address that shows up as being occupied by a convicted sex offender? There's a list, by the way. There's a registry. Ever looked on the convicted sex offender registry? It's kind of scary. You see all the little dots of how close some actually live to your house. And the registry itself has the age of the perpetrator and the age of the victim. And sometimes if it's like an 18-year-old guilty party and a 17-year-old victim, it could be bad, or it could be because it was a boyfriend, girlfriend, and parents weren't happy about it. So not as creepy as if it's a 17-year-old victim and a 65-year-old. Obviously, that's always not going to work. If that's the case, and you know a convicted sex offender lives nearby, you do not have to disclose it. What if your client has 8 children, all under 5, and that registry reveals that this is a 50-year-old that offended, harmed a kid in that same age bracket? Still something you're not required to disclose. You can point your client to the registry, let them do their research. Here's the problem, and here's why I think it's probably not a requirement for a material fact. What if that address that supposedly has the sex offender, what if that sex offender convicted felon, there have been a couple of felons in the world in history who lie. Not all of them, but maybe some of them. Maybe when they said what address they'll be living at when they get released from prison, they actually didn't live there. Maybe they moved away and they shouldn't have, and they didn't report it to their parole officer. For some reason, they're not really in that property that's on the registry. But the house across the street that's trying to sell, innocent person, innocent seller, just trying to sell their house, can't, because on the registry it says the one across the street has a person in there. So it's harming this owner from maybe even harming their values, keeping them from selling for top dollar. So I think that might have something to do with it. But it's those 3 things that are stigmatized properties not required for disclosure: sex offender nearby, death, suicide, haunted. And then finally, 3 days after closing, the buyer finds out that the seller's son committed suicide in the basement. The agent never disclosed this fact, and the buyer is furious. What remedies are available to the buyer? What could the buyer do in this case?
Nothing.
Exactly right. What's the broker obliged to do?
Nothing. There was nothing to disclose.
Exactly. Nothing to disclose. If they're asked, they have a choice. They could either say, I'm not telling, or they could say the truth. They can't say, no one ever died here. And then if the person had HIV or AIDS, they could say they died here if they choose to, but they can't say how. How'd they die? I'm not at liberty to tell you. You kind of just did. So that's its own thing. But it gets kind of precarious, but I haven't seen it in real life in the wild too much. We're going to continue on this path tomorrow. Have a great evening, and I'll see you tomorrow night.